Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the George W. Norris Legislative Chamber for the 86th day of the 108th Legislature First Session. Our chaplain for today is Wilson Metz, Word of Hope Lutheran Church in Ashland in Senator Bostelman's district. Please rise.
Before I pray, I just wanted to share with you that every Monday at noontime, you have people praying for you for good decisions, and we just lift you guys up in prayer. Let's pray. God, as I stand here this morning in the presence of these elected officials, but more importantly, in your presence, I am so thankful for this state, this country in which we are all so blessed to live. I believe each of these men and women have been called by you and put in these positions to be used by you in special and unique ways. Every person in our great state is to be subject to the decisions of this body of legislators. May they legislate with great care and wisdom. I'm reminded of what the Apostle Paul writes in the scriptures. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except by God's appointment, and the authorities that exist have been instituted by God. The responsibility of these men and women is great. My prayer is that you would give each man and woman godly wisdom as they make their decisions, that they would always remember that they have been called to serve the people of this great state, that they would be protected in body, mind, and spirit so they can be effective in their decision making. I pray that you bless each session of the legislature, and you will cause the folks to come together in unity to bless the people of this great state of Nebraska. And I pray that you give each person the heart of a leader, the heart of a warrior, and a caring heart for the people of Nebraska. May we continue to be part of the one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Amen. And may God bless you.
I recognize Senator Von Gillern for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. I call to order the 86th day of the 108th Legislature First Session. Senators, please record your presence. Roll call. Mr. Clerk, please record.
There's a quorum present, Mr. President.
Thank you. Are there any corrections for the journal?
I have no corrections this morning.
Are there any messages, reports, or announcements?
There are, Mr. President. Communications from the governor. Engrossed Legislative Bill 63A, 683, 683A, 565, 565A received in my office May 23, 2023. These bills were signed and delivered to the Secretary of State on May 26, 2023. Signed sincerely, Jim Pillen, Governor. Additionally, engrossed Legislative Bill 254, 254A, 191E were received in my office May 24, 2023. These bills were signed and delivered to the Secretary of State on May 26, 2023. Committee report from the Health and Human Services Committee concerning the gubernatorial appointment of Timothy A. Tesmer as Chief Medical Officer for the Division of Public Health, Department of Human Services. Additionally, committee report on the gubernatorial appointment to the Board of Emergency Medical Services. That's all I have this time, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Senator Moser has a guest under the south balcony, Alan Woodworth from Cascade, Colorado. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Senator Holcroft has two guests under the south balcony, Tim Lorenz of Gretna and John Byrne of Papillion. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Speaker Arch, you're recognized for a message.
Thank you. Regarding the agenda this morning, we will need to pass over the first item, which is the A bill on 50A. At the request of the fiscal office, they need a new amendment on that, and so we'll return to it later in the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Senator Breezy, you're recognized for a message.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a reminder for any members interested in being considered for appointment to either of the two select interim committees, the deadline to send a letter or email to my office is noon today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Breezy. Mr. Clerk, for the first item.
Mr. President, select file Legislative Bill 531A. Senator, I have nothing on the bill. Senator Ballard for motion.
Senator Ballard, you're recognized for a motion.
Mr. President, I move that LB 531A be advanced to E&R for engrossing.
Members, you've heard the motion to advance to E&R engrossing. All those in favor vote say aye. All those opposed, nay. It is advanced.
Mr. President, next item, select file Legislative Bill 727A. There are no E&R amendments. Senator Linehan would move to amend with AM 1998.
Senator Linehan, you're recognized to open.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. So this is a fix-it amendment that the fiscal office gave to me that we need to amend to 727A. Thank you.
Seeing no discussion, Senator Ballard, you're no. The question is the adoption of AM 1998. All those in favor, vote aye. All those opposed, vote nay. Record, Mr. Clerk.
34 ayes, no nays on adoption of the amendment, Mr. President.
The amendment is adopted.
I have nothing further on the bill.
Senator Ballard, you're recognized for a motion.
Mr. President, I move that LB 727A be advanced to E&R for engrossing.
Members, you've heard the motion to advance LB 727A to E&R engrossing. All those in favor, say aye. All those opposed, nay. It is advanced.
Mr. President, select file next bill, Legislative Bill 514, priority motion. Senator Slama would move to bracket the bill.
Senator Slama, you're recognized to open.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning, colleagues. I will tell you right now, in terms of preview of future amusements. This will go 4 hours. Unfortunately, negotiations did not bear fruit over the 4-day Memorial Day weekend. I can go in and talk about what happened there later on in the morning, but for right now, I would just like to, on this particular bracket, raise some of the constitutional issues that are very clearly at issue here. I have sent a request for a formal AG's opinion, Attorney General's opinion on the reasonable impediment language, which I believe is so pervasive throughout this bill that if the reasonable impediment language is challenged in court, it would lead to the entire bill being thrown out, not just the reasonable impediment language. So the severability clause would not matter in this situation because the reasonable impediment language is so intertwined throughout the bill. So I would like to continue to make a record of the constitutional concerns with this Evnen amendment that was adopted by the body on first round debate. We'll start with Section 5, which violates the National Voter Registration Act. Secretary Evnen said he would use Section 5 of his amendment when people register to vote so as to prevent non-citizens from getting on the voter rolls in the first place. So that's simply not what the language of this amendment does. And I would invite you, as you're listening today, to listen to what I'm saying, listen to the sections I'm referencing, because you don't need to be a lawyer to understand what's going on here and understand and see things that just aren't there. So Section 5 of the Evnen AM, that's 1801, so it's the mainline language of the bill now since it was adopted. The Secretary of State shall develop a process to use the information in possession of or available to his or her office to match and verify the citizenship of the corresponding registered voter. So this use of the term registered voter rather than applicant or some other term clearly shows that it only applies to somebody who is registered to vote. So that registered voter, that's the key language in Section 5, that's a big problem. Removing someone who is already registered to vote without a conviction is a clear violation of the National Voter Registration Act, NVRA. It's 52 U.S. Code 20507A3. And that indicates that a registered voter can only be removed from the voter rolls in 4 very specific situations. The voter requests to be removed, the voter died, the voter moved and certain criteria were met, or the voter was convicted of a crime that disqualifies them from voting. A simple citizenship check utilizing DMV data prior to removing a person from the voter registration rolls does not fall into one of these 4 very specific and limited categories. And there's a reason why this approach is a problem, and it's because we're taking registered voters off the rolls without any form of due process, violating their rights, not even giving them a chance to explain what could be going on. So for reference, my father-in-law was on the no-fly list for a number of years. Those of you who know my father-in-law, he's a delightful human. He works for the federal government. We get along anyways. But he showed up on that no-fly list because somebody with his exact same name had done some really bad felonies, like really not good things, to where every time David would try to fly, he would get pulled into a small room. They would do a check. He would have to prove that he's the non-felon Legrone and go from there. So the language here in Section 5 doesn't give anybody that chance. It doesn't give them a chance to prove up of saying, hey, I'm popping up on this list because there's somebody else that's convicted. There's somebody else that died. There's somebody else with my same name. And if you have a very common name, we have a lot of Mikes and Johns in here. That's something that could very plausibly happen. There's a reason why we have due process when it comes to registered voters in the NVRA. So my amendment, which I proposed, required investigation and prosecution. An investigation to properly ensure that the voter is in fact someone that needs to be removed from the voter rolls. And an investigation by the Attorney General's office only after enough evidence has been discovered to confirm that the individual being removed has committed voter falsification. So you have to get a conviction first before you remove them from the voter rolls. That's NVRA federal law language that we can't work around, but that Section 5 is clearly in violation of. So Secretary Evnen's amendment with that Section 5 language is a clear violation of the National Voting Registration Act. Sections 10 and 11, these sections place undue burdens on the fundamental right to vote. Section 10 and 11 of the Secretary Evidence Amendment are unconstitutional because the affidavit requirement it creates is both confusing and ambiguous and fails even a rational basis review under the U.S. constitutional law. As I mentioned on the floor during general file, like any second-year law school student could tell you that failing a rational basis review from a court is nearly an impossible task. Like, your language has to be impressively bad for it not to hold up under rational basis, and that's what we're looking at here in sections 10 and 11. So under this level of review, courts can bend over backwards to try to save your law. Like, they can pull things from the sky if they want. So when you have language that fails a rational basis review, it's like the court is sending you a direct message that you need to go to jail and do not pass go, do not collect $200. So let's go into the specifics on why Section 10 and 11 of the Evidence Amendment fails to pass this rational basis review. Under both the United States Constitution and the Nebraska State Constitution, voting has been found to be a fundamental right. Those are the cases that I referred to earlier, Burdick and Takushi, that's a 1992 ruling, and the Nebraska State Constitution 122. Burdens on this long-recognized fundamental right to vote are subject to two different levels of scrutiny depending on the burden imposed on the voter. The level of review that is relevant here is rational basis review. So I'm not even going with the moderately difficult basis of review. We're going with the lowest level, which is rational basis. And that's based on the language of the Burdick versus Takushi language from 1992. So in a case directly on point, and I reference this case ad nauseum because it is directly on point, the Missouri Supreme Court found that a confusing and ambiguous affidavit failed the rational basis review and was therefore unconstitutional. So an affidavit being used when it came to voting and elections, almost exactly like what we're trying to do here with the Evidence Amendment 1801 that has now become LB 514. So let me reemphasize that. In a case directly on point, i.e. a case with fact patterns nearly identical to our situation here, a court disregarded an affidavit because it was unconstitutional. In the legal field, we call this a cattle case. That means you have to find a case just like yours. Lawyers dream of cases like this when they do legal research because all they have to do when making an argument is to say, look right here. The court got it right in the same situation. They have made a final ruling in the same situation. So we don't have to look very far or wait for a court decision on an issue like this because they already have. Now let me go further into the details on why the Evidence Amendment and the affidavit found in sections 10 and 11 are unconstitutional. The Evidence Amendment on the affidavit says that a voter who has a reasonable impediment to voting does not have to show an ID. It's literally voter ID without the voter ID. But it does not define what a reasonable impediment is. The voter then has to fill out an affidavit once they've claimed they have a reasonable impediment, claiming that they have a reasonable impediment, and the affidavit restricts voters to 3 possible reasonable impediments. So you have a choice between 3 boxes to check. But a voter may legitimately believe that their circumstances qualify as a reasonable impediment under the amendment language, but is not listed on the affidavit. If the amendment wanted to limit reasonable impediments to those listed on the affidavit, it should say so both in the text of the amendment and on the affidavit. So saying, if you're going to claim a reasonable impediment to not show an ID in order to vote, you have to pick from one of these 3 options. Your reasons have to fall within one of these 3 options, or it's not a reasonable impediment. So we don't define it in either the language in the statute or on the affidavit. Because it does not, the affidavit is ambiguous and confusing. Thank you, Mr. President. Ambiguous and confusing to the voter. Let me turn on my light real quick. Under this logic of the Missouri Supreme Court, then, it fails rational basis review. While the Missouri Supreme Court case is not controlling, a Nebraska court or a federal court would analyze the amendment under the same standard. Therefore, we can be confident that this amendment places an undue burden on the fundamental right to vote under both the U.S. Constitution and Article 122 of the Nebraska Constitution. And I'll save the rest for my next turn on the mic, which, if I'm able to see correctly, is going to be in about 10 seconds. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. And Senator Slama, you're next in the queue.
Good golly gosh, what a happy surprise. So just hopping back into where we were at in terms of describing why sections 10 and 11 are problems, you'll find that the common thread through most of these constitutional concerns are the reasonable impediment language. That is the biggest problem we faced, and I spent a 4-day Memorial Day weekend proposing different concepts to clarify this. For some reason, like one of the things that was really fought over was whether or not we would call it reasonable impediment or something like specific impediment or impediment. And then later I found out that it really didn't matter what we were going to call it. I wasn't going to have the option to change it. Section 10 and associated sections of Secretary Evnin's amendment violate Article 122 of the Nebraska Constitution by failing to actually implement the voter ID provisions required by that article. Before casting a ballot in any election, a qualified voter shall present valid photographic identification in a manner specified by the legislature to ensure the preservation of an individual's rights under this Constitution and the Constitution of the United States. That's the constitutional amendment that was overwhelmingly supported by the voters on a 65-35 margin, so that's by 30 points. So if you're sitting here going, I just don't support voter ID, I don't see why we have to do it, we're on like steps, that's step 1, we're on like step 75 here. So if you oppose voter ID, like at this point, the voters have approved language in our Constitution that does require not just voter ID, but photo ID. So that's the baseline of what we're working through today, not do you like voter ID or not. It's literally, are we following that Article 122 language? It requires the legislature to pass a law that says how somebody shows an ID, not whether they can show an ID. Like, go through, read the constitutional amendment very carefully. We're not talking about a whether or not they can choose. It's not a may. It's not a may in the may versus shall debate. It's a how. Like, what things qualify as an ID? At the same time, the hierarchy of laws demands that this provision passed by the voters be interpreted as consistent with the United States Constitution. In Crawford versus Marion County Election Board, the U.S. Supreme Court found that under the U.S. Constitution, there are only select groups of individuals that may receive special accommodations under voter ID laws. They include, quoting from the case, they include elderly persons born out of state who may have difficulty obtaining a birth certificate, persons who, because of economic or other personal limitations, may find it difficult either to secure a copy of their birth certificate or to assemble the other required documentation to obtain a state-issued identification, homeless persons, and persons with a religious objection to being photographed. So those are very clear categories. Other states have picked other categories, like domestic violence victims, and a few, like you just suffered a natural disaster and you don't have access to those documents. Texas has that language. Domestic violence is in the Wisconsin language. I was open to any of those, but the powers that be were insistent upon an umbrella reasonable impediment language that flies in the face of sections 10, that flies in the face of the Nebraska State Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. So when you take the language from the Crawford versus Marion County Election Board language with the Nebraska Constitution, what this means is that the Nebraska Legislature must pass a law implementing voter ID that only, 1, makes an exception for those with a religious objection, and 2, makes accommodations for all other groups mentioned by the U.S. Supreme Court. If we cannot make accommodations for those groups,
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President, then they too would be exempt. However, the text of the constitutional amendment requires that anybody outside of these groups show a valid ID. The Evnin Amendment, Section 10, and related sections go far beyond this by allowing somebody to vote if they're sick or they don't have a birth certificate. So the last category is really very concerning because the U.S. Supreme Court has explicitly said that having to go and acquire the appropriate documents to get an ID is not an undue burden on the right to vote. So getting the paperwork, getting the birth certificate, getting the proof that you are who you say you are is not an undue burden on the right to vote. Therefore, the Evnin Amendment violates the Nebraska Constitution and betrays the will of the voters that everyone show an ID. And I'll pick up where I left off on my next turn on the mic. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Dober would like to announce some guests under the north balcony. They are Mary Gilmore from Vancouver, Washington, Annie Cardenas from Stillwater, Minnesota, and Julie Sawyer from Victoriaville, California. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Senator Hansen, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I encourage all my colleagues to at least be engaged and listen to both parties. I think, I obviously on a personal level trust Senator Salam and trust Senator Brewer wholeheartedly. I think they both make some interesting points. And so I'm doing my best to listen to all of what they have to say, talking to Senator Brewer's committee clerk or his staff also, and asking pertinent questions about how this works and how it pertains to my district. So I encourage all my colleagues to do the same. And so with that, I will yield the rest of my time to Senator Salama if she so desires.
Senator Salama, that 4 minutes, 15 seconds.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, Senator Hansen. I appreciate it. And I do agree with you on, I trust Colonel Brewer wholeheartedly. He's one of the first people who took me under his wing when I first got appointed, and really took the time to show me the ropes. So I appreciate him. This filibuster, this lack of negotiations isn't due to anything that the government committee did or didn't do. It's not because of anything the legislature did or didn't do. I think that everybody in the legislature who was involved in negotiations this weekend was doing so very willingly, very openly, and very much in good faith. Where the good faith went away was when we interacted with some folks in the executive branch, specifically the Secretary of State's office. And it's unfortunate because we really do have an amendment here that does not follow through with the wishes of the voters. It's not clean. The thing that the government committee was told was that this was a clean amendment. That's what was reported to them. But that's clean on the basis of the review of the Secretary of State's office. The Attorney General didn't look at this before it was introduced. He didn't know it existed. So there's a reason why I have a formal opinion request up at the AG's office right now, because I absolutely believe in what I'm talking about here. The reasonable impediment language is the biggest problem with this bill. And throughout this weekend, that was the language of just not showing an ID because you don't feel like it. That was really the sticking point, I think, if there was any room for negotiations at all. So back to the Section 10, Section 11 concerns I have with this bill. So my amendment, on the other hand, made accommodations for all of the groups that are outlined by the Supreme Court while requiring those who do be exempted that they are exempted. The Secretary of State is to aid these individuals in obtaining the necessary documents to get an ID at no cost. If they cannot, the Secretary of State can provide them with an exemption or provide an ID for them. This is a process that we spent months working on, that pressure release valve for working through what if all of the what ifs when it comes to the voter, like what if they don't have a birth certificate? Okay, if they're a Nebraska citizen, we can take care of that pretty easily. Well, what if they weren't? So what if they were born outside of the state of Nebraska or even outside of the United States? Okay, well, we can handle that by saying that the Secretary of State's office will make a reasonable effort to get that voter the documentation that they need at no cost to them. Well, what if the Secretary of State cannot find those documents? Well, the Secretary of State, upon doing a reasonable investigation, can provide them with an exemption or provide an ID for them if worse comes to worse. So all of these different layers are things that we considered in my language that aren't taken into account on the AM 1801 language that became the LB 514 language. It's just an umbrella reasonable impediment. You either fall into one of these three categories.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Or you go beyond those categories. Both of those have problems. So I'll touch on Section 12, but I do think I'm next up in the queue. And if anyone wants to ask me questions about this, I'm not having my staff work this. Everything you are hearing me talk about on the floor is my effort to get into the legislative record and to talk with each of you as to the problems with this bill. So please ask me questions on or off the mic. I don't care. I am here, and I'm here for the next 4 hours or like into the early afternoon. But I think I'm next in the queue. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. And you are next in the queue, and that's your last time before your close on the motion.
Gosh, how much time flies when you're having fun. The next section up that I have concerns about is section 12. This is that religious exemption language. So if somebody has a religious objection to being photographed, that's something you have to consider when you're talking about the language of a voter ID law. And the way that it's handled in section 12 of this bill with the Evident Amendment adopted, it violates a religious objector's fundamental right to vote as outlined by the United States Supreme Court. Because section 10 and 11 are really problematic, and we may as well work under the assumption that they're going to be struck down, once you strike that language, section 12 would automatically subsequently become unconstitutional under that Crawford case, because there would no longer exist any exemption for those that have a religious objection. So the objection on section 12 extends to both if 10 and 11 fall, section 12 has problems, but even if section 10 and 11 do stand up on their own, we run into the problem of forcing people who have a religious objection to the right to vote to constantly confirm that they still have this belief that they don't believe in being photographed. And if you have a belief so strongly that you religiously object to being photographed, that's not going to change in every election cycle. That's going to be one of the most consistent beliefs that a person can have. And I simply don't think it's reasonable, and that it's an undue burden on those voters to reconfirm, re-up with the Secretary of State's office before every election. Section 17 through 19 either violates the fundamental right to vote or violates equal protection law as articulated by the United States Supreme Court. Case law is directly on point. It also violates the amendment passed by the voters by allowing non-exempt, as defined by the U.S. Supreme Court, persons to vote without showing a valid ID. There are two possible interpretations of section 17 through 19. One is that no one would check to see if the voter actually had a reasonable impediment to vote, thus not actually requiring anybody to show an ID. As we already discussed regarding sections 10 and 11, this would fly in the face of voters and would clearly violate the Nebraska Constitution. The other interpretation would be that the election officials in each and every county would be left to interpret whether an individual has a reasonable impediment. With the fact that Nebraska has 93 counties and at a minimum 93 different election officials would be making separate determinations of whether a reasonable impediment existed. An election commissioner in Scottsbluff County might interpret someone's cold as a reasonable impediment, while an official in Otoe County might say that it's not. Therefore, you have different standards between who can vote and who cannot with this section, and that's a big problem. And we'll go into more detail on my future turns on the mic about how this could actually open up county clerks to criminal liability if they improperly grant the reasonable exception or if they improperly deny the reasonable exception, which is not defined formally in either the affidavit or the statute. So you have county clerks operating in a clear gray area and risking a misdemeanor of improperly running their elections if they get that interpretation wrong. So such a possibility of those different sets of interpretations would violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment as outlined in Bush v. Gore. In other words, if this is the correct interpretation and people's reasonable impediments have to be checked, this amendment will turn all of our elections into the fiasco that was Florida in the 2000 presidential election. And this is something where I think Senator Conrad and I actually had a very good back and forth about whether or not, thank you, Mr. President, had a very good back and forth about whether the scope of Bush v. Gore was applicable in a broad sense. I believe it is, and I believe it's directly applicable here. Or Senator Conrad interpreted Bush v. Gore as narrowly applying to counting votes in different ways in different counties. So that's where we've actually disagreed. That's one of the very few points in which we've actually had a debate back and forth. So I do appreciate that angle. And since I only have like 15 seconds left, I will save everything else for my next time on the mic. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Raybold, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, fellow Nebraskans. I just also want to say thank you very much to the Government and Veterans and Military Affairs Committee for their work that they did on this piece of legislation, being very mindful of how our voters wanted us to move forward on a voter identification bill, and it left it up to us. You know, we certainly reached out to the election commissioners throughout the state of Nebraska, the county clerks who do the work day in, day out when it comes to all of our elections in our state of Nebraska. And we really owe them a debt of gratitude for their feedback, their input on how we can craft a bill that would not disenfranchise the 11 counties that are already doing exclusively vote by mail and have been doing so for more than a decade, or the other 8 counties that have a number of precincts that do vote by mail exclusively in those counties. And we certainly wanted to make sure that we followed all the federal guidelines so that we would not disenfranchise. And so I want to thank all those who spent all the hours putting in the hard work to come up with a bill that most of us would find acceptable. I know that there are a number of us who feel that it is not even needed because we don't have any incidents of fraud, voter fraud in our state. And so we wanted to move forward with some bill that would not disenfranchise people. So I wanted to read one of the letters that we got from the AARP that was really very helpful and insightful, because we certainly didn't want to create any impediments to our aging population, who, by the way, are some of the best voters in our state of Nebraska. So this is a letter. It was written to us February 1st. Chair Brewer and members of the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee. My name is Susan DeCamp, and I am testifying today as the AARP Nebraska State Volunteer President in opposition to LB 535. AARP has been fighting to protect the rights of all Americans 50 plus to vote freely, easily, and safely for more than 35 years. We have a long history of nonpartisan voter education and engagement, providing voters with information on the voting process, as well as where candidates stand on issues important to our members and their families, so they can make their own decisions before or on Election Day. While AARP Nebraska recognizes that Nebraska voters approved Initiative 432 to amend the state constitution to require valid photo identification in order to vote, we have concerns that legislation in response could erect unnecessary barriers to older voters, those with disabilities or mobility issues, and qualified voters who are part of a non-English speaking language minority. Older voters turn out overwhelmingly in every election. An AARP survey conducted shortly after the 2022 midterms showed that in 63 of the most competitive races for the U.S. House of Representatives, voters 50 plus made up 61% of the ballots cast. We are concerned overly strict voter identification legislation would reduce older voter turnout in Nebraska. In fact, a government accountability study conducted in Tennessee and Kansas showed that in the 2012 election, changes to voter ID requirements in both states reduced turnout between 1.9 and 2.2%. Compared to other states that did not make changes. For that reason, AARP believes that any changes to the voter verification process should ensure thank you, Mr. President, increased access, fairness, and simplicity, not unnecessary complexity. With regards to LB 535, which for people watching out there was the predecessor to LB 514, we are particularly concerned about the provision that requires voters to present an unexpired photo ID in order to vote, and the requirement that voters provide a driver's license number, state ID, or a copy of another acceptable ID when requesting a ballot. Requiring only valid photo ID to vote could potentially disenfranchise tens of thousands of our fellow Nebraskans who lack an acceptable identification document. Groups here in Nebraska have estimated anywhere from 55,000 to 70,000 Nebraskans lack the required identification document. This requirement will hit voters of color the hardest. Several studies have shown that voters of color are particularly impacted by voter ID
That's your
laws.
time,
Thank you,
Senator.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Raybold. Senator Lowe, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. I yield my time to Senator Slama.
Senator Slama, that's 4 minutes, 53 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And in giving Colonel Brewer credit, I'm not giving Senator Lowe nearly as much credit in terms of he's like the only person in the legislature I actually knew before I got into politics. I actually worked with his wife, Kim, on a campaign beforehand, and they've just been really wonderful. They've been like my adoptive political parents, and it's just been great. So thank you for that, Senator Lowe. Just to respond to Senator Raybold's points, I really don't know how to respond except like these are points that could have been raised in February. We're so far beyond this language now. I moved in making expired licenses acceptable. We created special nursing home IDs. We created an extensive outreach program. None of this has anything to do with the debate on the quality of LB 514. I'm not trying to put my personal amendment on here. I'm simply pointing out the fixes that need to be made with LB 514. So if you're going to get up here and read a letter from the AARP about something that happened months ago and a version of the bill that came up months ago, it really shows to me a lack of engagement. I want people to engage on these constitutional issues, these constitutional problems. And I'm really hoping that somewhere in the 4 hours, we will have an honest exchange about, okay, well, I see what you're talking about when it comes to the constitutional language. Maybe we could fix this and this, or I disagree with your reading of the NVRA, or I disagree with your reading of the state constitution. All of those things would be amazing, but anything outside of that really doesn't get to the substance of my objections. And I'm really, really excited to just engage with somebody who's willing to engage on these points, because on first round debate, I could have been off the mic 4 hours earlier. All I was asking was that either the chairman of the government committee or the speaker get on the mic and say, we will work with you to try to address these problems between general and select. I never got that. I talked up here for 4 extra hours hoping that that would happen, but it didn't, unfortunately, and we're at where we're at now. So I don't take filibustering lightly. I don't take filibustering lightly at all. At the end of the day, I took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and our Constitution requires voter ID as of the November 2022 elections. So I'm going to follow through with my oath and with the will of the people. Like this approach of LB 514, it's voter ID without voter ID. We're saying that if somebody has a mail-in ballot, that ID number that they give is never going to be checked for accuracy. And moreover, you can't check it for accuracy because under Section 19, we're requiring that that vote be counted even if there's nothing there. And then if you're voting in person, so long as you have a reasonable impediment that's not defined in statute, it could literally be anything, you don't have to show an ID in order to vote. And all of these provisions would be fine if we didn't adopt a strict voter ID law with photo ID. We did, the voters of Nebraska did overwhelmingly support a strict voter ID constitutional amendment, and we have to follow through with those wishes. Like, this bill is the equivalent of putting, if we were to legalize cannabis in any way, shape, or form, if we were to have John Keane be the cannabis czar. Like, it just doesn't make any sense, and this bill has been taken by those who don't actually support voter ID. Who don't actually support voter ID to put together the biggest loopholes they can think of and the most gray areas that they can think of to create workarounds as to a very clear constitutional amendment that the voters approved. Thank you, Mr. President. So if you care about the will of the voters, if you care that we overwhelmingly passed a constitutional amendment requiring that you show an ID in order to vote, I'm asking you to stand with me and at least block cloture on this. At least come to the table and say, I want to find compromise language, because thus far, I've just been throwing things at a wall and getting nothing in response. So I'm hoping the 4 hours we have on the floor today will be productive. If nothing else, it helps build a legislative record, and I'm more than happy to do that. It's an unfortunate situation, but it really just is what it is. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Raybold, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. And, I agree with Senator Slama. It is really important to establish a body and record. And for the record, we know that 92 out of the 93 counties have reviewed LB 514. They gave additional input and feedback, but they said 92 out of the 93 counties in our state of Nebraska support LB 514. And that's something pretty important to take into consideration. They're the ones that know how to implement safe and secure and fair elections to everyone. And you know what? They're so accustomed to people coming in, going maybe to the wrong polling place, wanting to vote. And, they know how to deal with these type of cases and issues. We need to trust our election commissioners, our county clerks, and other election officials. They know how to put out great elections with no fraud. And so what do? If someone comes in with whatever type of issue or concern, they allow that person to vote because their goal is to not disenfranchise a single voter. So what do? They have this person fill out a provisional ballot, and guess where it goes? It goes in a provisional envelope. So, recently we've heard how sometimes it takes at least 3, maybe 4, up to a week to clear up some of those very close races because they're working very diligently and very carefully through all those provisional ballots. What does that mean? What does that look like? When they have something that maybe a signature doesn't match on a vote by mail ballot, or if they have some concerns about someone who voted in person, they follow up diligently at the county level, getting more information, following up with this individual, verifying their current address, their new address, or maybe their vote by mail ballot went to, clearing up any type of impediment to make sure that voter's vote is counted. They have been doing this for decades. They understand how to do elections safely and securely. And I think we need to trust them. They had a chance to review each and every condition in LB 514. We also had the Attorney General's office review it over the weekend. They made minor clarifications, which we hope to take up in an amendment. And if they don't get taken up, it is not going to impact us delivering to our voters their expectation of voter identification. So I'm really proud of the work the committee did and all the input that we got from the election commissioners and other groups like the AARP. So I wanted to finish up with what time I have, the letter from the AARP. We hope the committee will consider exemptions that could allow older voters who no longer drive to use an expired driver's license. And a side note, we are allowing older citizens and other people to use expired means of identification. So rather than require them to get a new ID, the committee should also consider exemptions or other accommodations for individuals in congregate settings, like long-term care, those with disabilities who may have particular trouble acquiring a new ID. While we agree that LB 535 now LB 514 should include provisions for a public awareness campaign to educate voters on the change, we would suggest that this campaign be conducted in multiple languages, including Spanish. Any funding for a campaign should also include radio ads in addition to the website requirement and television ads. So I want to say to the listening audience out there, we are doing that. In this piece of legislation, LB 514, we have an extensive outreach to the community campaign, as well as training sessions for some of these new language on voter identification for all the election commissioners, county clerks, and the poll workers to make sure that we can continue to provide flawless elections in our state of Nebraska. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Raybold. Senator Lowe, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Lieutenant. Governor, and I yield the rest of my time to Senator Slama.
Senator Slama, that's 4 minutes, 55 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you again, Senator Lowe. I really do appreciate it. Just to respond briefly to Senator Rabel, besides the reading of things that weren't relevant, the first thing that she spoke about was how there was an amendment proposed by the Secretary of State's office this weekend. Here's how negotiations went on that, because I don't think Senator Rabel was at all involved. I agreed to use that amendment as the starting point. Like, I didn't even go off of LB 514. I went off of the fix-it amendment that the Secretary of State tried to present. The problem with that amendment is you're not actually resolving any of the issues. You're not. And in my counter proposals, I was shot down. It was either you take this amendment or you walk. And the problem is I have this loaded with amendments on select file and final reading, and you're not going to get it attached without my blessing. But they decided to try to go over my head, to cut things off. I understand that. I was negotiating in good faith. I know some other people were absolutely negotiating in good faith. Some people were not. So that's why we're here where we are today, at the Secretary of State's insistence that this is a clean bill, clean amendment. It's perfect in every way, shape, or form, save for we didn't actually have the Attorney General do a review of it before we introduced it. And now I have to go through and do a formal opinion request from the Attorney General so that we can get a preemptive look as to what a court battle is going to look like and see if we can't just do a last-second save on a Hail Mary for some of this reasonable impediment language. We're here because for 5 months, actually since November of last year, we have one entity in the executive branch, the Secretary of State's office, who's been doing everything they can to undercut and undermine voter ID. So unfortunately, you're not going to talk me down from this. I am going to go 4 hours. And if we want to talk about the problems inherent in the Secretary of State's 1996 amendment, I will absolutely talk about that. But until those problems are addressed, for me, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going for 4 hours because I don't even hear any interest from the other side of, hey, and I mean specifically the government committee, people involved on other sides of the negotiation. I have had senators come up and ask if there are things that we could do to adjust it. The problem is that my fix-it doesn't sound like it would get 33 without the blessing of the Secretary of State. And at this point, I don't see that happening. So for those folks watching at home, that's what's going on. So I'll hop in back to my constitutional concerns. We're on this last section, section 23. So when you take section 23 with the rest of the Evnen Amendment, section 23 violates the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment. The United States Supreme Court has held that a state cannot discriminate against a person based on where they're from as it relates to exercising a constitutionally protected right. It's from the Bolton case in 1973. Voting, as I've already stated, is a constitutionally protected right. So the Evnen Amendment only pays for the documents required to get IDs for people born in Nebraska. For people born in Nebraska, which is really interesting because the Secretary of State himself was born in Sioux City. So he would be excluded under the section 23 language as well. So if you're born out of state, most people don't get to choose whether they're a Nebraskan. At a certain point, it does become a choice, but a baby being born does not have a choice as to whether or not they're being born in Nebraska. So if you are born out of state, it doesn't pay for the documents that you need in order to vote. So we're setting up a poll tax for those who are born outside of the state. This is a clear burden on a fundamental right based on the state a person was born in. Thus,
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thus, the Evnen Amendment violates the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Democracy is strongest when every voice is heard. The Evnen Amendment is voter ID without voter ID. This is not what the people voted for with Initiative 432. This allows for exceptions that swallow the voter ID requirement and blatantly ignores the will of the people and betrays the purpose for which the initiative was passed. The effect of a representative democracy is to refine and enlarge public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best dyson the true interests of the nation. That's from James Madison, and that's the language that's keeping me going today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Wayne, you're recognized to speak.
Yield my time, Senator Slama.
Senator Slama, that's 4 minutes, 54 seconds.
Outstanding. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. And while I'm getting ready to bring up my next thing on the mic, if my wonderful legislative aide could print off the LB 1801 language, I would like to read that reasonable impediment language aloud, just so everybody here can follow along and understand where my objections are. Because I have worked to be very specific in where I see the problems as and why. If you have questions after this mainline speech that I offered, please ask me questions on the mic. If you have questions of, hey, section 5, I don't quite understand what you're talking about there. Can you explain it for me? Like, literally ask me on the mic, off the mic, I don't care. I am here to be a resource. This is something I fought for years. It's something that a number of conservative senators have fought for years, including former Senator LeGrone, former senator and former auditor Charlie Jansen, and current state treasurer, and somebody who's really gone to bat in favor of voter ID, and actually in my own amendment was willing to take on a role that would normally be the Secretary of State's role, but he was unwilling to do. John Moranti, he's stepped up and gone above and beyond in support of voter ID and following through with the constitutional language. So I truly am appreciative of his efforts on this front and the efforts of everybody who came before me on this front, because this isn't just a Julie Slama objection to LB 514. This is an objection to the legislature is screwing up by adopting LB 514, something that's been in the making for years. And I get it. It's easy to listen to the special interest groups that give doomsday scenarios about what's going to happen if blank passes, what's going to happen if this happens. Those were boogeymen in a closet that we talked about and handled. Thank you. In the lead up to the vote on voter ID itself, in the lead up to November 2022. So if you don't like voter ID, that's fine. Like, two people can have a very reasonable disagreement on its necessity and its value. I wholeheartedly support it. Where we're running into problems is the implementation of the language. Because right now you have entities that have always opposed voter ID, hijacking this bill, turning it into LB 514, and taking the voter ID out of voter ID. We're flying this in the face of voters. We're gutting the language that they overwhelmingly supported. And this shouldn't be that complicated. I have a stack of emails very high asking, well, why is this so complicated? This shouldn't be that complicated. There shouldn't be that many arguments over process and implementation. Guess what? You're right. It should not be that difficult. But when we run into a situation in which the Secretary of State is unwilling to actually enforce the language of the constitutional amendment, we end up here. And I've fought since the start of session to bring everybody around the table. I've made moves. I moved from, on LB 535, making it a notary requirement, to witness attestation and notary, to ensure that mail-in voting has the same standard of showing and presenting that photo ID when they vote. Because mail-in voting is voting, and it should be treated the same under the constitutional amendment language. So I ended up getting negative feedback on witness attestation and the notary combo, even though over a dozen other states have some combination of witness attestation or notary or both. And I just said, okay, as a compromise, what we're going to do is verify, I guess, the license number that the voter provides. Thank you, Mr. President. We're going to compromise and just verify the ID number that the voter provides, and make sure that it's like not just a random pairing of numbers. That turned out to be a big stumbling block. Verifying that a person is actually giving you their ID when it comes to mail-in voting was one of the biggest stumbling blocks, I guess. In terms of negotiations, I have given up things in this that I cannot wrap my head around. We have an endorsement of ballot harvesting in LB 514 that I was working to adjust in that section 15 language. That was another stumbling block. So for me, this is about following through with the will of the voters. And you're going to have me standing in your way for the next 3 or so hours. We have a lunch break in between, but I'm not standing down. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Doran, you're recognized to speak.
I'm not going to ask you questions. Take a break. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you, Mr. President. thought I'd give up and give Senator Slama a little bit of a rest here for a few minutes. Just wanted to talk a little bit about, I call it, what has all gone on here with our voter ID or voter process here in the state of Nebraska. I think most people are familiar with that. This was a petition. It came forward and it was on the ballot last year. And this passed pretty, I call it a pretty strong margin, 66, 67% in favor of it. Part of what that process though said though, and there's wordage in there that says it now will be developed by the legislature. And Senator Slama in the first round debate, others got on the mic too and talked about the fact that there has been many discussions, many conversations with Secretary of State, with the committee, with her, with other people involved about how do we, I call it, structure now our voter ID process here in the state of Nebraska. There is definitely some discussion or some comments. Senator Slama this morning's talked a lot about will Attorney General, will this pass, I call it a non-lawyer, will this pass muster by the courts and by the Attorney General and all of that? That's part of the reason why we have Senator Brewer's LB 514 that the government committee has come forward with. And so now that is the bill in front of us, and Senator Slama was bringing about her process of challenging some of these things. So I just want the people in Nebraska to know of all the discussion that's gone on with this, all the conversations. This morning, Senator Slama has been on the mic talking all morning. There are different little breakout groups, and one of the little breakout groups was underneath the south balcony here, where the legal counsel for the government committee had about 3 or 4 senators over there, and they were asking questions. He was explaining this part of the bill, or this part of the process. It was just interesting to stand there and listen to that different conversation, and I call it the little technical details, and that's a lot of what Senator Slama has been pointing out all morning and in the first round debate too, is basically it's the little technical details. I think when most people voted for this, for voter ID, you just assumed, yes, here, show your driver's license, we're done, let's go. There is so much more to this process, and part of that, it's kind of fitting that today in today's Nebraska Examiner, there was an article about, I call it electronic registration information senators, or it's called ERICA, where certain states have gone together and they share now somewhat. The process is they share voter information so that if somebody now is passed away or somebody's not able to vote in a certain state, now that's shared with another state. When I read the article, this happened several years ago where some of these states started to come together to share some of this information, and we're up over 20 of them. But now we're starting to see some states, I call it, opt out because of the technical part of all of this stuff and all of this information, getting it together and getting in the right spot. One of the things that explained in there, and also I know part of our discussion here in the state of Nebraska, was the DMV, or Department of Motor Vehicles, they do have a database with a lot of this kind of information in there. But because of confidentiality and other reasons, those aren't able to be shared, and you can't just exactly go and say,
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're going to go and use that information from them and cross-check. There is a process whereby you probably can't, but maybe can, and all these other things. And this voter ID thing that many people, when we voted on it, were like me and go, oh, this will be easy. We'll come about it in a short period of time and we're done. Oh my gosh, to watch this process play out, watch what every side has gone through. I know the hearing, when the committee hearing and all of those things, my gosh, this has been a lot more, I call it detail oriented than anybody imagined. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Dorn. Seeing no one else in the queue, Senator Slama, you're recognized to close on the bracket.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, everyone, for the thoughtful discussion. And thank you especially to Senator Dorn. I appreciate it. I'm going to run this filibuster just like I did the last time. I'm not going to actually take any of these motions to a vote. I'm not going to waste time on a call in the House. So don't worry about missing a vote. I'm going to pull everything as we go, and as I get to my closing, the last vote that you'll have to take is either a cloture vote or, God willing, if we have some sort of magical compromise appear in the next 4 hours or so, the agreement to get that amendment on. So those are the two ways that you may be asked to vote in the next 4 hours, but it's not going to be on whether or not we should bracket the bill or recommit it. Those are the two procedural motions that are up before we get to my amendments. And the amendments are actually a great time for if anybody has compromise language for me to look at, if it's any different from what happened this weekend, or if somebody can show me, okay, everybody's on board, what do you think? And it's something that I can approve, I will absolutely substitute out my amendments on the ENR amendments for the compromise amendment. I'm giving you that commitment now. I have done everything I can in good faith for the last 5 months. And this is me giving another ask and hopefully giving enough time to where if you can throw me a compromise that's not AM 1996, that's more closely in line with AM 1997, which I proposed, with the same commitments that I was seeking in terms of follow through and investigatory powers, I'll consider it. I'll look at it. I'll give you a yes or no, and maybe we can move forward and make this bill better. But for right now, I have yet to see an amendment that adequately addresses the problems that have been raised not only by me, but by several election law experts in the state of Nebraska and otherwise. Senator Dorn's right. Like, this should have been a very simple process. 35 other states have some form of voter ID laws. About a dozen of them have similar language to what we've implemented, which is a strict voter ID law. Well, a strict voter ID constitutional amendment. We're obligated to have language that falls on that more strict side. LB 514 doesn't get us there. It says we're not going to check your ID numbers if you do mail-in ballots. We're just going to take you at faith. And if you take that language that I'm referencing from Section 10 and you combine it with Section 19, not only do they not have to check whether you have a valid license number or not, Section 19 obligates them to count that ballot even if they just have like 911 as their number for a ID, or even if they have nothing at all. This is all extremely technical, and I get that this is very similar to if we have any runners on the floor, like you're running a marathon and you hit the wall around mile 17 or 20. This is like saying once it gets hard at 17 or 20 to go, all right, I'm going to hop into my car. I'm going to go get ice cream because it'll make me feel good. I'm going to have my car drive me across the finish line. Like, these are all very valid technical issues that I'm willing to work with anyone on. The problem is that every solution I've presented has been shot down. I've been told it's my way or the highway from the Secretary of State's office. And that just is what it is, but it's the situation that we have ourselves in now. And I'm going to stand up and fight for the will of the voters who are getting steamrolled with this current process. And just to reference, something that's kept me awake from the last debate was when a senator got up and they listed off all the groups that they had been meeting with and talking with to try to reach a compromise. And they rattled off a lot of groups that have been traditionally opposed to voter ID. And out of all the groups that were listed off, not a single one was a proponent of voter ID. So this amendment was crafted specifically with those who oppose voter ID in mind.
1 minute.
The people who do not like voter ID, who have opposed it every step of the way, have now hijacked this bill and turned it into one of the most lackadaisical voter ID approaches in the country. And with the language that we adopted in our constitutional amendment, we can't do that. We don't have the flexibility to do that. The voters were very clear in what they approved. You show an ID in order to vote in the state of Nebraska. It's high time we followed through with that language. The people have spoken, and now it's time for us to follow through. Thank you, Mr. President. I withdraw my bracket motion.
The motion is withdrawn. Mr. Clerk.
Mr. President, some items quickly. Your Committee on Enrollment and Review reports legislative bill 157 to select file with ENR amendments. Additionally, your Committee on Enrollment and Review reports legislative bill 50, 92, 92A, 227, 227A, and 727 as correctly engrossed and placed on final reading. Mr. President, concerning legislative bill 514, Next motion, Senator Slama would move to recommit Legislative Bill 514 to the Government Committee.
Senator Slama, you're recognized to open on that motion to recommit.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning again, colleagues. One of the points I wanted to make abundantly clear with this reasonable impediment language is the consequences of having such a large gray area as to whether or not the three options provided in the affidavit are all-encompassing of possible reasonable impediments that voters can reference in order to not show an ID in order to vote. And my biggest concern is for our county clerks when it comes to this language, because when you look at Nebraska State Statute 32-1519, it outlines that any judge of election who A, knowingly receives or sanctions the reception of an improper or illegal vote from any person who is not a registered voter, B, receives or sanctions the reception of a ballot from any person who refuses to answer any question which is put to him or her in accordance with the Election Act, C, refuses to take the oath prescribed by this act, D, sanctions the refusal by any other judge or election to administer any oath required by the act when such oath is required, or E, refuses to receive or sanctions the rejection of a ballot from any registered voter at the place where such registered voter properly and legally offers to vote, shall be guilty of a Class 3 misdemeanor. Any judge or clerk of elections on whom any duty is enjoined by the act who willfully neglects any such duty or who engages in any corrupt conduct in the discharge of his or her duty shall be guilty of a Class 3 misdemeanor. Like, I'm really hoping county election officials and county clerks are watching from home, because this reasonable impediment language brings criminal liability on you. Like, if you fail to verify within the gray area of whether a person actually has a valid reasonable impediment, and you either allow them to vote beyond the scope of the reasonable impediment language, or you disallow them from voting because their reasonable impediment is outside of those three reasons for voting, you're running the risk of violating 32-1519 and putting yourself at risk of a Class 3 misdemeanor. Like, these are real world consequences when we put together a bill with clearly unconstitutional language when it comes to reasonable impediment. There's a reason why I'm hammering reasonable impediment so hard, is because not only does it fly in the face of the voters, but its lack of clarity sets us up for a lawsuit that I'm going to guess that we're going to lose. And two, it sets up our county election officials who are just trying to do their jobs. It sets them up for criminal liability. LB 514 does not do right by our county election officials. And I'm asking any of you who are watching, which I know a lot of you are, and I appreciate you tuning in, look into these statutes, look into the reasonable impediment language for yourself, and decide if you as a county election official know exactly what they're talking about when it comes to reasonable impediment, and have a clear-cut view of what reasonable impediment means. Because if you fail to follow whatever the interpretation of reasonable impediment ends up being, whether it's the three options or more expansive beyond that, you're lining yourself up for a Class 3 misdemeanor. And I don't want to stand idly by while that happens. When I'm talking about the reasonable impediment language, I'm not only hammering it because of the constitutional side, I'm hammering it because I'm protective of our county election officials. And I don't want to see them sitting in jail because they were just doing their jobs. It's hard enough to find volunteers as it is. But when we give them gray area language like this, you're setting them up for failure. So my ask this weekend was define reasonable impediment. Give me a clear outline of what that means, and we can get there. So that 32-1519 language on reasonable impediment is very near and dear to my heart, because our county election officials are outstanding people, and I don't want to see them get into any kind of criminal trouble because they failed to follow through on the reasonable impediment language that is as clear as mud in LB 514. Now I'm just going to take a minute and I'm going to read through the reasonable impediment language. We're going to work through sections 10 and 11, and I'm going to skip ahead to 19, because how they interact with each other and tie in is something that I hope everybody is listening to, because it's a real problem. So section 10, and this is referencing the AM 1801 language. A registered voter shall fill out a provisional voter identification verification envelope if the voter fails to produce valid photographic identification at the polling place, and the voter's name appears on the precinct list of registered voters for the polling place, or the voter has voted a provisional ballot as provided in section 32(9)15. The voter fails to produce valid photographic identification at the time of voting early in person at the office of the election commissioner or county clerk, or the voter has a reasonable impediment, there's that reasonable impediment language, preventing the voter from presenting valid photographic identification, or the voter's name appears on the precinct list of registered voters for the polling place with a notation that the voter has a religious objection to being photographed. 2, each voter casting a ballot using a provisional voter identification verification envelope shall enclose the ballot in an envelope marked provisional voter identification verification, and shall, by signing the certification, there's a lot of cations in here, on the front of the envelope or a separate form attached to the envelope, certify the following facts. My name is blank. I am registered to vote at blank. I did not provide valid photographic identification as required by law, or I have a reasonable impediment preventing me from presenting valid photographic identification. I am eligible to vote in this election and have not voted and will not vote in this election except by this ballot. And I acknowledge that my ballot will not be counted if I do not provide valid photographic identification to my county election office on or before Tuesday after the election, or, like the key in this language is, or I have a reasonable impediment that prevents me from presenting valid photographic identification, and I do not complete a reasonable impediment certification, or B, my county election official cannot verify the signature on my reasonable impediment certification. The voter shall sign the certification under penalty of election falsification. The following statements shall be on the front of the envelope or on the attached form. By signing the front of this envelope or the attached form, you are certifying to the information contained in this envelope or the attached form under penalty of election falsification. Election falsification is a class 4 felony and may be punished by up to 2 years imprisonment and 12 months post-release supervision, a fine of up to $10,000 or both. Now we're getting into section 11. Which is the Secretary of State shall provide a standard certification for a voter with a reasonable impediment preventing the voter from presenting valid photographic identification. The certification shall include the following as separate boxes that a voter may check to identify the applicable reasonable impediment. Inability to obtain valid photographic identification due to disability or illness, or lack of birth certificate or other required documents, or a religious objection to being photographed. Now, this language is a problem because the certification shall include the following as separate boxes that a voter may check to identify the applicable reasonable impediment. So on one, we have lack of a birth certificate or other required documents. So that is a case on point that the Supreme Court has thrown out, saying you cannot say that inability to get a birth certificate or other required documents is adequate enough to qualify for an exemption from voter ID, because you have the ability to get those documents. The Secretary of State has the ability to perform a reasonable investigation to assist you in getting those documents. And the problem with this last section, in the first paragraph of section 11, the certification shall include the following as separate boxes. This is not necessarily an all-inclusive list. We could say disability or illness, lack of a birth certificate or other required documents, or religious objection to being photographed. Those are the 3 options given right now, but that's not a ceiling, that's a floor. You have to have at least those 3 options. You could have another other box that says other reasonable impediment. You could say, well, as a voter, I think that me having my dog eat my ID card is a reasonable impediment, and genuinely believe that, not fall under any of the 3 exceptions, but be forced, in order for their vote to be counted.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. To sign one of these boxes to violate the Election Falsification Act, which is a class 4 felony. And we're putting that on our election commissioners to define reasonable impediment for themselves. It's not defined in statute. It's not defined on this affidavit. And that's a problem because of the Missouri case that I referenced at the start of this. The Secretary of State shall provide the form of the certification to the election commissioners and county clerks. A voter who has a reasonable impediment, still not defining it, shall execute the certification. The election commissioner or county clerk shall verify the signature on the certification with the signature appearing on the voter registration record. A voter who casts a ballot by mail shall include the certification with the application, except that a voter who casts the ballot pursuant to 32953 shall include the certification within the ballot envelope. And I'll come back and go through sections 19 on my next turn. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Wayne, you're recognized to speak. Senator Ballard, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Slama yield to a question?
Senator Slama, will you yield to a question?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Looking at section 19, I'm reading the language right now, and it says the certification matches signatures. Can you kind of describe what the amendment means by matching signatures?
Yeah, the fail-safe that is utilized by the Secretary of State's office in this process is if the person says they have a reasonable impediment and they don't show a voter ID for this really all-expansive list of reasonable impediments, the election commissioner then has to have them sign, just like they're normally voting, and then verify that signature to their signature that they have on file. So that signature is interpreted by the Secretary of State's office to be an adequate enough ID in this situation.
Okay, so just to confirm, they would not have to show an ID.
No, they would not.
Signature. Okay. Thank you, Senator Slama. I'd like to yield the rest of my time to Senator Slama.
Thank you, Senator Ballard. Senator Slama, that's 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Senator Ballard. I do appreciate it. And that was the perfect segue into my discussion on Section 19, because it's important when we're talking about the language of Sections 10 and 11, where those have problems. Those problems are doubled under the application of Section 19. So if you look at Section 19, it starts on page 22 of 514. And you have to go through a few extra sections that aren't being touched here, which is fine. The problem comes on page 25 when you're looking at subsection E. In the case of a ballot received from a registered voter who filled out the reasonable impediment certification pursuant to Section 11 of this act, the ballot shall be accepted for counting if the signature on the certification matches the signature on file with the election commissioner or county clerk, the name on the identification envelope appears to be that of a registered voter to whom a ballot has been issued or sent, the residence address provided on the identification envelope is the same address at which the voter is registered or is in the same precinct and subdivision of a precinct, if any, and the identification envelope has been signed by the voter. So this takes away any of those reasonable impediment requirements. This is where sections 10 and 11, along with section 19, directly conflict with each other, because we're saying in section 19 that as long as this envelope is signed and certified, as long as the name on the identification envelope appears to be that of a registered voter who asked that a ballot be sent to them, and as long as their residential address kind of sort of matches within some gray area, the address that we would expect that person to be, and as long as the identification envelope is properly signed, you're required to count that ballot. We don't even need a reason. We don't even need a reasonable impediment reason. We're just assuming the reasonable impediment to be adequate. You don't have to give the reason so long as it's reasonable in your own mind. You get to opt out of even putting your driver's license number or a copy of your valid state ID in with your vote. Which for me, like this section 19 language, I'm asking you, just read the 3 paragraphs on page 25 and read those in the context of section 10 and 11 and tell me that those two don't conflict with each other. Like, I'm more than happy to engage there, but what we're saying under section 19 is you have to count those ballots so long as it's signed and the voter kind of sort of matches what you would expect from that voter. That's a problem. That's a real problem, not only for voters, not only for the constitutional amendment language that says any reason, by saying here in section 19 that any reasonable impediment is going to be good enough. And 3, thank you, Mr. President. Wow, that's Senator Von Gilleren is in the chair for the first time. He is a freshman. He's done an outstanding job. And now I'm going to make sure there are enough procedural motions to make his head explode. That Senator Von Gilleren is a wonderful human, and I'm glad to see him up in the chair. But they directly conflict with each other to a degree in which our county clerks will be potentially running afoul of 32-15-19 in interpreting reasonable impediment to mean anything but everything that could possibly be a reasonable impediment. Because it's not defined in section 19, it's not defined in LB 514, it's not defined anywhere in statute. The only thing we get that's even remotely close to a definition is a floor of you can either have disability or illness, you're unable to get the documents, which we have a Supreme Court case on point that says that's not a valid workaround for voter ID. Or,
That's your time. Thank you, Senator
Thank you.
Ballard and Senator Slama. Senator Erdman, you're recognized to speak.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll come back.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate that. Listening to the debate this morning, I've always wondered why the bill I introduced for voter ID, LB 230, didn't catch much traction or attract much attention. It was a very straightforward bill, very simple, and what I believe, common sense approach. But you need to remember that common sense is a flower that doesn't grow in everybody's garden. So maybe that's the reason. But 230 was introduced for a photographic ID, as the voters had suggested we do, or demanded we do. And so these are some of the provisions that were in 230. Those submitting for provisional ballots without showing qualifying photographic ID must do so at the county election office on or before the following Tuesday in order for their ballots to be counted. So you went to vote, you didn't have a valid ID, you voted a provisional ballot, and then you had till the next Tuesday to prove who you were with a photographic ID at the clerk's office. Those qualifying to vote early must present a photographic ID along with their application. And those who are handicapped or who are members of the armed forces or are members of the National Guard shall qualify for early voting. So it was a provision for those who couldn't get to the polls. An agent delivering a ballot to a registered voter shall pick up the ballot no later than 1 hour prior to the closing of the polls and return the ballot to the polling place before the polling place closes, along with a color photocopy of the registered voter's qualifying photographic ID. The bill also said that it criminalizes any election official or election worker who scans a qualifying photo ID or who does not require a voter to show qualifying photographic ID when voting. So there was a provision in there to make sure that we were adhering to the law and the statute. The bill also required, and I'm not sure about that one, whether they would have accepted that one, to put an American flag on each driver's license or state identification card. The bill also prohibits fees for issuance of state identification cards used for voting purposes and prohibits a fee for issuance of birth certificates used to obtain state identification to be used for voting purposes. There's a very straightforward, very simple bill that dealt with the issue exactly as the voters voted for. It never got any traction. Not once did anyone call me, contact me, and say, what can we do to help implement this, or what does this section mean, or how can we address something different in your proposal? Not once. So we have been discussing voter ID for months. And here we are in the fourth to the last day talking about voter ID on select file. Select file. Perhaps it would be better if we waited till January to finish this up. Bring it up early in January, give us time to work on it, make it so it's constitutional according to everyone, and bring it back in January. And they say, well, we don't have time to implement all the regulations that need to be
1
put in
minute, please.
place before the primary. Well, maybe you have to work a little overtime. Maybe you have to work late. Who do these constitutional officers work for? We pass the laws, they implement them. What's the rush? And I'm not interested in having a special session. But we're going to rush through this because this has to lay over one day, at least one day, for final reading. That makes Thursday. So fixing anything in this bill is not going to happen. So what you see up there in 514 is what you're going to get. Will we consider 230? Not a chance. Will we consider a common sense approach to voter identification?
That's your
Not a
time,
chance.
Senator Erdman. Senator
Thank you.
Slama, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President, and completely agree with you, Senator Erdman. Just the timeline for how this exchange worked was the first time I really got any feedback back from the Secretary of State's office was in February after the first hearing on LB 535. That was the first time I got any real feedback from the Secretary of State's office of things that need to be changed in order to make LB 535 workable. Now, this isn't about me getting the credit. This isn't about, oh my gosh, we're not on my bill anymore, so we have to take it down. No, what I'm saying and what I'm outlining here is we couldn't even get the parties to come to the table and negotiate in good faith because about once every month from February to now, I'd find out that the Secretary of State's office has drafted an amendment that they're going to try to ram through and go around me, go around and work as much as necessary with the government committee on an amendment that is essentially an anti-voter ID wish list. It provides massive workarounds. And that's been consistent at every stage of debate. It was like once a month I would find out, oh wait, these meetings have been happening behind your back and we've decided that this amendment is the best way to go, like on my own bill. When the executive session happened for the amendment that would be attached to LB 514, I didn't even know that there was an alternative amendment even being shopped. I thought it was just a quick discussion of my own amendment that I had made clear and that I thought everybody was on the same page on of I'm willing to work with anyone. I'm willing to make any fixes necessary to this. But every month, it seems like on the dot, and I have text messages to show this up of I would find out that there was some agreed amendment happening behind my back, and then I'd have to go back for 2 days and shut it down and point out all the problems with it. This is the Secretary of State going, it's my way or the highway, and me going, I'll work with any, like I made movement on witness attestation, notary. All I said was that the Secretary of State needs to do their job in verifying that we're actually making the people who are required to show an ID in order to vote, requiring that of them. And that brings me back to section 19 of this bill. So just in closing, I completely agree with Senator Erdman. The language of 230, I even threw at the wall to see if it would stick. I was told by the powers that be, absolutely not. This is not about who gets the credit. This is about following through with the will of the people and embracing the language that they overwhelmingly adopted and not just taking the easy way out with some lackadaisical, fraud-friendly, loophole-filled LB 514. And this isn't speaking ill of Colonel Brewer or anybody on the government committee, because I've never actually seen this level of interference by a member of the executive branch in a piece of legislation before. Like it's almost laughable at a certain point to know that the Secretary of State in the last month has been bopping around trying to undercut voter ID as much as he can. Like that's concerning to me. That's executive branch interference with the legislative process. So I'm going to go back to section 19 because the E section that I referenced on page 25, so that's new language, that's a problem. But when you look at the full text of section 19 that's not changed, you run into even more problems. So I'm going to start with let me just double check here. Yeah, I'm going to start with sub 3 On page 23, in its review, the county board shall determine if A, the voter has provided his or her name, residence address.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. And signature on the voter identification envelope. B, the ballot has been received from the voter who requested it, and the residence address is the same address provided on the voter's request for a ballot for early voting by comparing the information provided on the identification envelope with information recorded in the record of early voters or the voter's request. So that section stands in direct conflict with sub E. It's just 2 pages later that says if your address kind of sort of matches and if you'd expect this name to be on a mail-in ballot, you have to accept it. C, a completed and signed registration application has been received from the voter by the deadline in sections 32-302, 321, or 325, or by the close of polls pursuant to section 32-945. And I will pick up on this where I left off. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator McDonald, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll yield my time to Senator Slama.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Slama, 4 minutes, 45 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator McDonald. Senator McDonald has been wonderful in volunteering to be a middleman when it comes to being the go-between. Several of my colleagues have been, and I'm just really grateful for them volunteering their time like that. Obviously, the negotiations did not bear fruit this weekend, and there are a lot of reasons why. And we've fleshed out some of them, but we'll continue talking about the problems with voter ID when you take it in the context of the full section 19, starting on sub E on page 23. A completed and signed registration application and oath has been received from the voter by the close of polls on election day if required pursuant to 32-946. In the basis of its review, this is sub 4, and this is that sub that includes the language on section 25. On the basis of its review, the county board shall determine whether the ballot shall be counted or rejected as follows. So counted or rejected. That's the key language here. That's what we're framing this discussion of section 19 through. A ballot received from a voter who was properly registered on or prior to the deadline for registration pursuant to section 32-302 or 32-321 shall be accepted for counting without further review if the name on the identification envelope appears to be that of a registered voter to whom a ballot for early voting has been issued or sent, the residence address on the identification envelope is the same residence address at which the voter is registered, or is in the same precinct and subdivision of a precinct, if any, and the identification envelope has been signed by the voter. In the case of a ballot, just a second. In the case of a ballot received from a voter who was not properly registered prior to the deadline for registration pursuant to section 32-302 or 321, the ballot shall be accepted for counting if a valid registration application completed and signed by the voter has been received by the election commissioner or county clerk prior to the close of the polls on election day, the name on the identification envelope appears to be that of the person who requested the ballot, the residence address provided on the identification envelope and on the registration application is the same as the residence address as provided on the voter's request for a ballot for early voting, and the identification envelope has been signed by the voter. In the case of a ballot received from a voter without a residence address who requested a ballot pursuant to section 32-946, the ballot shall be accepted for counting if the name on the identification envelope appears to be that of the registered voter to whom a ballot has been sent, a valid registration application completed and signed by the voter for whom the residence address is deemed to be the address of the office of the election commissioner or county clerk pursuant to section 32-946 has been received by the election commissioner or county clerk prior to the close of the polls on election day. The oath required pursuant to 32-946 has been completed and signed by the voter and received by the election commissioner or county clerk by the close of the polls on election day, and the identification envelope has been signed by the voter. In the case, and this is sub D right at the bottom of page 24, in the case of a ballot received from a registered voter required to present identification before voting pursuant to section 32-31801, the ballot shall be accepted for counting if the name on the identification envelope appears to be that of a registered voter to whom ballot has been issued or sent. The residence address provided on the identification envelope is the same address at which the voter is registered or is in the same precinct or subdivision of a
1
precinct,
minute.
if any. Thank you, Mr. President. A copy of an identification document authorized in section 3231801 has been received by the election commissioner or county clerk prior to the close of the polls on election day, and the identification envelope has been signed by the voter. So when you take this language, and then right after that is sub E of this language that's being changed, it's underlined. But when you take these 5 areas of what counts and what doesn't when it comes to voter ID, we're requiring that the counting board not do any checks on the validity of the ID. They don't have a choice. They can't do it. Within the very narrow realm of whether or not a ballot can or cannot be counted, the presence of a valid identification number or a copy of a valid ID is nowhere to be found. So we're saying that the counting board has to count these ballots.
That's your time.
Thank you, Mr. President.
And you're next in the queue, and that's your last time before you close.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. So we're saying under section 19 that there's no requirement that you prove up who you say you are. You could have that ID line be blank for all they care, and that will qualify as a reasonable impediment so long as your signature matches. It doesn't matter under section 19. Your ID or lack thereof does not matter. That stands in clear conflict with the language, not only in the constitutional amendment, but the language even found in sections 10 and 11. We're tying the counting board's hands in what's valid, what's not, and we're providing conflicting instructions as to what they need to follow. Like, please, somebody engage with me on this and tell me that what I'm seeing is wrong, because I've read it out loud for you guys. The plain language of the statute doesn't present any unknowns. It's the black and white text of what we're dealing with here. And we're saying, mail-in, like, not only do you not have to show your ID number or a copy, like, they have to count your ballot even if you don't include anything. So that's a very core issue that's very problematic for me. And I am hopeful that we can address it. And I want to take a moment now and just respond Secretary of State offered an explanation to 3 of the objections I raised. Before registration, when the applicant has signed a voter oath of your defiance, submit response that makes to get on registration our amendment to assure those that can't properly read my amendment or are taking it the wrong way that 32939 through 03 will remain untouched. And I'll get on my last point on the second point on my next turn on the mic, which will probably be the open for the committee amendment. I mean, not the amendment, my personal amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Mr. Clerk, for some items.
Mr. President, just an announcement. The Judiciary Committee will meet under the South Balcony at 11 o'clock a.m. for an executive session. Judiciary Committee under the South Balcony, 11 o'clock for an exec session. Additionally, motion to be printed from Senator Clements to, excuse me, a floor amendment from Senator Clements to LB 50. That's all I have this time, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Senator Slama, you are recognized to close on your recommit motion.
Thank you very much. And like I've committed before, I'm not going to take this recommit to a vote. This is actually the motion that I was most tempted to take up to a vote because I do think it's an appropriate route to send this bill back to committee for further compromises. Select file is the last train out of the station for potential amendments. So I do believe that recommitting it to committee would be beneficial. But I do have to push back against one point Senator Erdman made, which is a lack of appetite to handle voter ID with a special session in between the 23 and the 24 sessions. The problem with waiting until the 2024 elections, the 2024 session to clean up this language, to have implementation for voter ID language in place, it means that there just simply won't be enough time to implement voter ID before the 2024 presidentials. I don't want to be here in a special session this summer any more than anybody else. That's why I'm up here talking for 4 hours and why I stood up here for 8 hours on first round discussing all the issues inherent in this bill, because I don't want to come back for a special session. All I want is for these constitutional issues to be addressed adequately with the proposed compromise amendment. I don't want the credit for any of this. Like, I just want to pass good policy that takes the will of the voters into account. And if we're waiting for a 2024 regular session bill, we're going to be skipping over voter ID for the 2024 presidentials, which clearly, in my mind, flies in the face of the voters who implemented voter ID all the way back in November 2022. And I just don't see any movement happening in the time between where a special session could be held on voter ID and when a regular session vote could be held on an ID, other than we're making it impossible to implement before the 24 elections. Yeah, so I'm going to wrap up this point on the second objection provided by the Secretary of State's office to language of my amendment. Again, this has been rendered relatively irrelevant, but I do want to counter any points that might be made about my former amendment, even though it is dead, and that's fine. So sub 3 of the section 2 objection, finally, neither the Department of Justice nor anybody else has ever challenged these state voter ID laws on the grounds that they somehow violate the Uniform and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act. There are 12 states that require voters to witness or notarize their absentee ballots for their vote to count. And many of those states have had such requirements in place for years, like the Wisconsin requirement that's been in place since 2013. And during those many years, there has never been a challenge that such laws violate the Uniform and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act. And for reference, this is like saying that the witness attestation or the notary part of mail-in ballots is invalid because it's too much of a burden. Voter ID is one of the most litigated issues, short of like abortion and Second Amendment rights in our country, especially in the last 10 years. And nobody's even raised that a witness requirement or a notary requirement would somehow violate the Uniform and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. Like, it just hasn't happened. And voter ID has been litigated in all 35 of the states that have it until next Tuesday. And not once has this even come up. So I've really pushed back on those section 2 objections that my former amendment or any amendment that proposes witness attestation or a notary violates the Uniform and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. It just doesn't. I mean, entities who have challenged voter ID statutes haven't even looked at that as a plausible option.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. The third objection is, hold on, I have to get back to my notes. The third objection is the reasonable impediment certification is a fail-safe. Providing this sort of problem-solving process is important for any constitutional analysis similar to the one used by the Supreme Court in the Crawford versus Marion County Election Board 2008. I view this objection as a complete misreading of the Crawford case. While Crawford does point out that a relief valve must be in place to offer relief to voters, the case says that only require that relief valve for certain voters. And I'll get back into those categories on my next turn on the mic. And thank you, Mr. President. I withdraw that recommit.
The motion is withdrawn. Mr. Clerk, for items.
Mr. President, Senator Slama would move to amend with Floor Amendment 173, but I understand she wishes to withdraw and substitute Floor Amendment 189.
Without objection, so ordered.
In that case, Mr. President, Senator Slama offers Floor Amendment 189.
Senator Slama, you're recognized to open on F.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd just like to request a point of order. FA 180, whatever we're on, is an amendment to the E&R amendments. So that should be a second level amendment as I understand it.
Senator Ballard's here. Senator Ballard for motion.
In that
Thank
case,
you.
Mr. President, Senator Ballard would offer the E&R amendments. In that case, Mr. President, Senator Slama would move to amend the E&R amendments with Floor Amendment 189.
Senator Slama, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I apologize for that hiccup. I absolutely wanted the enrollment and review amendment to be able to be read across today. I think that our bill drafters do a wonderful job in fixing the grammatical errors that we find in our bills, and I think they do a wonderful job. This is my a shameless thank you to Marcia, who we've just way overworked this session. Marcia and the bill drafters have done an outstanding job handling an unprecedented number of bills introduced in a session and amendments and motions handled during a session as well. So thank you to the clerk's office, bill drafters, everybody who's been involved to keep this train running. So back to the third response that I have, which is a reference from the Secretary of State to the Crawford case, discussing that somehow the Crawford case would conflict with the amendment language about the relief valve. So as I've stated on this floor over and over again, the United States Supreme Court has stated that under the United States Constitution, there are only select groups of individuals that must receive special accommodations under voter ID laws. Elderly persons born out of state who may have difficulty obtaining a birth certificate, persons who, because of economic or other personal limitations, may find it difficult either to secure a copy of their birth certificate or to assemble the other required documentation to obtain a state-issued identification, homeless persons, and persons within a religious objection to being photographed. That's it. Those are the categories. That's all. Secretary Evnen is using the Crawford case to completely defang the ballot initiative that the voters passed, effectively creating an umbrella opt-out for showing a voter ID. If an opt-out was required, the logic would mean voter ID was unconstitutional, which is the opposite of what Crawford held. They're attempting to make a toothless abomination that removes all election protections that the people of this state have demanded and doesn't require anyone to actually show an ID. And this is true whether you're voting in person or via mail. In contrast, my former amendment creates the constitutionally required relief valve through the signature photo ID list. This allows those who have a constitutionally protected reason for not showing an ID to vote without doing so, while requiring an ID of everyone else. That's the language we have to follow. Like the Crawford case is directly on point in that you can't have an umbrella opt-out that says if you have a reasonable enough impediment, we'll call it good and you don't have to show your ID. No, you have to fall under very specific categories. You have the 4 that are here. You have Wisconsin, who protects victims of domestic violence. I'd be on board for that amendment. In Texas, they have an exception if you've recently experienced a natural disaster. I'd be game for that. But the point Crawford held is you have to have very specific reasons for why a voter ID in a strict voter ID state does not have to show an ID in order to vote. When you go beyond that with a catch-all, you're in clear violation of the language and going far beyond the language in Crawford. So since we're a decent ways into the morning, I would just like to take a refresher on my objections to LB 514 as it's drafted, because I do want these objections to be in the record several times over. But let me hit my button real quick first. So this amendment in this version of the bill, while seemingly intended to be a good option, is riddled with issues that violate the NVRA, the United States Constitution, and even our own Nebraska State Constitution. It even contradicts itself in the language it's using as to whether or not a person can vote without an ID. Starting with Section 5, which violates the National Voter Registration Act, NVRA, Secretary Evans said that he would use Section 5 of his amendment when people register to vote so as to prevent non-citizens from getting on the voter rolls in the first place. That is simply not what his amendment does. And this is like an overarching theme of the Secretary is going and saying, oh, we're doing all these wonderful things. We're doing citizenship checks. We're requiring people to prove they are who they say they are with mail-in voting. And we're going to use Section 5 to where it doesn't violate the NVRA. But that stands in conflict with the black and white letter of the bill. Like, you can say that if this bill passes, like pigs will fly, rainbows will come down from the heavens, the lion will sleep with the lamb, whatever, it doesn't change the language of what we're passing here. It's a very small amendment. Like, please, if you're on the floor and at least dug into this, please follow along for the problems inherent in this, because when the Secretary of State is pitching you talking points of, well, she's just confused on that point, listen to what I'm saying, listen to what my objections are, and then look at the text of the bill yourself. This doesn't take a law degree or any experience in this field to read and understand the workarounds that have been clearly put in place that not only flies in the face of voters and their overwhelming support of a strict voter ID constitutional amendment, it puts our county clerks in the position where they could be arrested for a Class 3 misdemeanor if they screw up any area of the gray in this language. So starting with Section 5, which violates the National Voter Registration Act, Secretary Evans said that he would use Section 5 of his amendment when people register to vote so as to prevent non-citizens from getting on the voter rolls in the first place. Cool, that's fine under the NVRA. That's okay. But the problem is that's not what the language says. Section 5 of this amendment states, the Secretary of State shall develop a process to use information in possession of or available to his or her office to match and verify the citizenship of the corresponding registered voter. Registered voter, like bold it, italicize it, put like asterisks around it, because that language, this use of the term registered voter, rather than an applicant or some other word to indicate somebody who hasn't registered to vote, it's clear that it only applies to somebody who is already successfully registered to vote. Removing someone who is already successfully registered to vote is a clear violation of the National Voter Registration Act, NVRA. That's 52 U.S. Code 20507A3. And that indicates that a registered voter can only be removed from the voter rolls in 4 very specific situations. The voter requests to be removed, the voter died, the voter moved and certain criteria were met, or the voter was convicted of a crime that disqualifies them from voting. So this 4th option is the route that you have to go under the NVRA and provide due process to that person who's already registered to vote, to provide them due process to cure the fact that they're not on the voter rolls, give them the opportunity to voluntarily get off, or prove that they are the person that's not the felon, like I talked about with my father-in-law's example of how there's another David Lagrone wandering off and doing malicious things. Prove that you're not that person, or at least be notified that you're being taken off the voter registration roll, so you're not bopping in on election day and being told that by participating in this election, you're committing election fraud. So a simple citizenship check utilizing DMV data prior to removing a person from the voter registration rolls does not fall into any of these 4 categories. That's why my amendment requires investigation and prosecution. You have to have due process in order to kick somebody off the voter rolls if they've already successfully registered to vote. An investigation to properly ensure that the voter is in fact someone that needs to be removed from the voter rolls. And an investigation by the Attorney General's office only after enough evidence has been discovered to confirm that the individual being removed has committed voter falsification. Secretary Evans' amendment is a clear violation of the National Voting Registration Act, and it falls on those 2 words, registered voter. If you change that to applicant, fine. But it's clear by dying on the hill of registered voter that the Secretary of State intends to use that language to take people who have already successfully registered to vote off of the voter rolls. That's a problem because it violates the NVRA, because you're going beyond those 4 specific categories and not giving that person who thought they had successfully registered to vote.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Due process before they either accidentally commit election fraud because they've been removed from the rolls without their knowledge, or not be able to register to vote at all. Sections 10 and 11. These sections place undue burdens on the fundamental right to vote. Sections 10 and 11 of Secretary Evans' amendment are unconstitutional because the affidavit requirement it creates is both confusing and ambiguous and fails even a rational basis review under U.S. constitutional law. So as I've talked about several times, like rational basis is the lowest bar you can get when it comes to a review. Like the courts will literally bend over backward to try to save your law. When a law fails rational basis review, that means it's like very impressively bad. Like the court is sending you a direct message, like go to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200 on a very basic level of the
That's your
legislature.
time,
Thank you, Mr. President.
And you're next in the queue.
Great. Sorry about my squeaky voice. My voice seems to be going out. My apologies for that. I will try to find a different register where my voice isn't cracking like a prepubescent teenage boy. So let's get into the amendments again on why the Evans Amendment, especially on Section 10 and 11, fails to pass this very low bar. Under the U.S. Constitution and the Nebraska State Constitution, voting has been found to be a fundamental right. So that's that Burdick versus Takushi case from 1992, Nebraska State Constitutional Article 122. Burdens on this long recognized fundamental right are subject to 2 different levels of scrutiny, depending on the burden imposed on the voter. The level of review that is relevant here is rational basis review, and that's off of the Burdick case. So rational basis is the lower of the 2 standards that you can review. So in a case directly on point, the Missouri Supreme Court found that a confusing and ambiguous affidavit failed rational basis review and was therefore unconstitutional. That's that Priorities USA versus Missouri case that I read in full on the Michael General file. Let me re-emphasize that. On a case directly on point, i.e. a case with fact patterns nearly identical to our situation here, a court disregarded an affidavit because it was unconstitutional. In the legal field, we call this a cattle case. That means you have found a case just like yours. It's directly on point. Lawyers dream about it when they do legal research because all they have to do when making an argument is to say, look right here, the court got it right in this same situation. It's a really handy tool, and I'm really grateful Priorities USA versus Missouri has already been ruled on because it is directly on point with sections 10 and 11. So we don't have to look very far or wait for a court to decide an issue like this, because they already have. Now let me go further into details on why the Evans Amendment and the affidavit found in sections 10 and 11 of the Evans Amendment are unconstitutional. The Evans Amendment on the affidavit says that a voter who has a reasonable impediment to voting does not have to show an ID. But it does not define what a reasonable impediment is. We discussed this ad nauseum. It's just not there. The voter has to fill out an affidavit claiming a reasonable impediment. The affidavit restricts the voter to 3 possible reasonable impediments, but a voter may legitimately believe that their circumstances qualify as a reasonable impediment under the amendment language, but it's not listed on the affidavit. If the amendment wanted to limit reasonable impediments to those listed on the affidavit, it should say so both in the text of the amendment and on the affidavit. Because it is not, the affidavit is ambiguous and confusing to the voter. Under the logic of the Missouri Supreme Court, then, it fails rational basis review. While the Missouri Supreme Court case is not controlling, a Nebraska court or a federal court would analyze the amendment under that same rational basis standard. Therefore, we can be confident that this amendment places an undue burden on the fundamental right to vote under both the United States Constitution and Article 122 of the Nebraska Constitution. Section 10 and associated sections of Secretary Evans' amendment violate Article 122 of the Nebraska Constitution by failing to actually implement the voter ID provisions required by that article. Before casting a ballot in any election, a qualified voter shall present a valid photographic identification in a manner specified by the legislature to ensure the preservation of an individual's rights under this Constitution and the Constitution of the United States. It requires the legislature to pass a law that says how somebody shows an ID, not whether, thank you, Mr. President, not whether or not they can show an ID. It's just a matter of how. It's not a matter of yes or no. In Crawford versus Marion County Election Board, the U.S. Supreme Court found that under the U.S. Constitution, there are only select groups of individuals that may receive special accommodations under voter ID laws. They include elderly persons born out of state who may have difficulty obtaining a birth certificate, persons who, because of economic or other personal limitations, may find it difficult to either secure a copy of their birth certificate or to assemble the other required documentation to obtain a state-issued ID, homeless persons, and those with a religious objection to being photographed. That's it. That's all. You have to be specific and cover these 4 categories when you're talking about a relief valve. And I'll come back to that on my next turn on the mic. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama, and you are next in the queue.
Outstanding. Well, thank you, Mr. President. And as my voice becomes squeaky, it's important to get this on background that my husband is sick with a sinus infection at home. I didn't think he'd get me, but he did. So I apologize for my voice. If anybody has a lozenge or something that I could suck on while we're up here, that might help. But otherwise, I'm just going to power through. Senator Kavanaugh just gave me a whole pack of Ricolas, and that's just amazing. Thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate it. And I have to say, I really do have a special connection with Ricolas because my husband and I honeymooned in Switzerland, and we actually got to see where they started Ricola. And it's very cool. It's this beautiful herb garden, and it's very peaceful in the Swiss Alps. So when you take the Crawford language with the Nebraska Constitutional Amendment, what this means is that the Nebraska Legislature must pass a law implementing voter ID that only 1, makes an exception for those with a religious objection, and 2, makes accommodations for all other groups mentioned by the Supreme Court. If we cannot make accommodations for those groups, then they too would be exempt. However, the text of the Constitutional Amendment requires that anybody outside of these groups show a valid ID. So the Evans Amendment, Section 10, and related sections go far beyond this by allowing somebody to vote or if they're sick or they don't have a birth certificate. This last category is really problematic because the United States Supreme Court has said that having to go acquire the appropriate documents to get an ID is not an undue burden on the right to vote. Therefore, the Evans Amendment violates the Nebraska Constitution and betrays the will of the voters that everybody shows an ID. My amendment, on the other hand, made accommodations for all of these groups while requiring those who needed to vote under the constitutional language, taking the case law into consideration, requiring that they show an ID. The Secretary of State is to aid these individuals that run into problems in obtaining the necessary documents to get an ID. If they cannot, the Secretary of State can provide them with an exemption or provide an ID for them. So this last paragraph on So how are you going to get this person the documents they need to vote? How are we going to connect these people with their birth certificates, social security cards, or whatever documentation they need to get a state driver's license or a state voting ID, preferably a state voting ID? And one of the pushbacks we received was that helping voters get these documents would simply be too onerous of a task. Can't do it. It's impossible. We'd have an influx of people, we'd have a flood of people who don't have documents, and the Secretary of State's office is not well equipped to handle those. See, that sounds legitimate until you look at how Missouri has implemented their voter ID language. They have an extremely strict voter ID setup. They say for mail-in balloting, you either get it notarized or it doesn't count. Strict notary. And when it comes to getting people connected with the documents they're required to have, the Secretary of State's office in Missouri has one full-time employee who can easily handle all of those requests, all of them. All it takes is one FTE to fulfill the requirements of actually ensuring people have the documents necessary in order to vote. So it's not too onerous. Our neighbors in Missouri have already done it, and they've done it the right way. Section 12 violates religious objectors' fundamental right to vote, as outlined by the United States Supreme Court. Because Section 10 and 11 are unconstitutional and will be struck down, Section 12 would be automatically and subsequently become unconstitutional. Thank you, Mr. President, under Crawford, because there would no longer exist any exemption for those that have a religious objection. So when we're talking about the reasonable impediment language, it is so intertwined in the language of 514 that if you were to run into the buzzsaw of the court saying you can't have a catch-all when it comes to reasonable impediment and not requiring people to show an ID in order to vote, you get rid of that reasonable impediment language and suddenly you've compromised the rest of the bill. Reasonable impediment is so intertwined that no matter what severability clause you add into this bill, it's not going to matter because you get rid of the reasonable impediment language and then you don't have any of the required exemptions or special assistance that is required under federal case law. Section 17 to Section 19 either violate the fundamental right to vote or violates equal protection law as articulated by the United States Supreme Court.
That's your time.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Albright has some guests under the south balcony. Her granddaughters McKinley and Landry Cordes and their father Lee Cordes. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Senator Slama, this would be your close on the floor amendment.
Great, thank you very much. Sorry, just a second. Okay, so our discussion of Section 12 and the problems inherent in the reasonable impediment language takes us to another section where this reasonable impediment language is a problem, and that's Section 17 to Section 19. So these sections either violate the fundamental right to vote or violate the equal protection law as articulated by the United States Supreme Court. We have case law directly on point here. It also violates the amendment passed by voters by allowing non-exempt, as defined by the United States Supreme Court, persons to vote without showing a valid ID. There are two possible interpretations of Section 17 through 19. One, and I think the one interpretation that we've all found to be most likely, is that no one would check to see if a voter actually has reasonable impediment to vote, thus not actually requiring anybody to show an ID. As already discussed regarding Sections 10 and 11, this would fly in the face of the voters and would clearly violate the Nebraska Constitution. The other interpretation, which I view as the less likely interpretation, would be that election officials in each county would be left to interpret whether an individual has a reasonable impediment. Now, this is a problem because we have 93 counties and would have, at a minimum, 93 separate sets of eyes and election officials making separate determinations as to whether a reasonable impediment existed. An election commissioner in Kippahaw County might interpret someone's cold or their dog eating their ID as a reasonable enough impediment, while somebody over in Boone County would say that it's not. You open the door for inconsistent applications of reasonable impediment language. And no matter if you go with a broad interpretation of the reasonable impediment language and say everybody gets to have a reasonable impediment in order to vote. Everybody qualifies. All you have to do is mark the box saying, yep, I've got a reasonable impediment. There's no checking. That's that broad reading of the reasonable impediment language. Or if you go with a more narrow one, you're setting up 93 plus different standards for election officials in each county to set up and interpret for themselves. No matter what, you're setting our county election officials up in a gray area where they could accidentally end up violating 32-15-19, which is a class 3 misdemeanor. It's already hard enough to get folks that are willing to be county clerks or county election officials. It is a thankless job. And I'm literally just trying to protect them from unnecessary prosecution when they're just trying to do their jobs to the best of their abilities. So such a possibility of that narrow interpretation, it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment as outlined in Bush v. Gore. In other words, if this is the correct interpretation and people's reasonable impediments have to be checked, this amendment will turn all of our elections into the fiasco that was Florida in the 2000 presidential elections, to where anybody, and we have, this is actually an important point to make, because we do have, we do follow the main way when it comes to our elections. We split our electoral college votes, 2 are statewide and then 1 for each congressional district. You do have a situation in our state where 1 congressional district could be the deciding vote in a presidential election. And if you're saying that that 1 vote, no matter if it's within the state or within that congressional district, where you have Douglas County interpreting something differently from Sarpy when it comes to reasonable impediments, you are literally lining yourselves up for the same dumpster fire. I think that's the scientific term of it, of what happened in Florida in the 2000 elections. This is something that is entirely preventable. Thank you, Mr. President. Something entirely preventable that we can all see is coming. And I'm asking this legislature to be proactive about and to not put our county clerks in the position where they're going to be made criminals because this amendment has failed to clarify what a reasonable impediment is. We've created a floor that ends up being a catch-all, and that flies in the face of the constitutional amendment. It flies in the face of the will of the voters. Thank you, Mr. President, and with that, I'll withdraw that amendment.
The amendment is withdrawn. Mr. Clerk, for items.
Mr. President, single item, new LR 274 from the Judiciary Committee that will be referred to the Executive Board. Concerning LB 514, Mr. President, next amendment, FA 174, Senator Slama would move to withdraw and substitute for FA 190.
Without objection, so ordered. Senator Slama, you're recognized to open on the FA 190.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate it. This is another amendment that I will be pulling at the end, but I will ask Senator Kavanaugh if she'd be willing to yield briefly to a question.
Senator Kavanaugh, will you yield to some questions?
Yes, I would be happy to.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. I have just one question, and then viewers at home will watch me scurry behind you to get a quick break. Do you have anything you'd like to talk about today?
I do. Thank you, Senator Slama. So people were a little concerned. I appreciate the concern. I wasn't here this morning. Unfortunately, I had a family friend pass away, and so was at a funeral this morning, and it was a Jewish service and was really beautiful. And it was for my dear friend Nancy Hornstein, who I've known literally my entire life. She passed away last week, and she was a wonderful person, a beautiful soul, a beautiful heart, and I will miss her so much. But as with all things in life and death, there's an opportunity to celebrate, and her children were visiting, and so I got to see them, and I hadn't seen some of them in a few years, so that was really nice opportunity to catch up. Couldn't stay, couldn't linger at the services to get back here, and I'm not used to being away The only time I've ever missed a day in my entire time here was when I had COVID. I missed one day, and then I spent the rest of the time up in the balcony, and you had green and red cards to vote, and you had to text the clerk, who was a different clerk at the time, had to text him if you wanted to get in the speaking queue. And there was just a piece of paper up there that said text this number to get in the speaking queue, and it didn't say whose number it was, and that's how I got Patrick's cell phone number, because I didn't have it before then. Ha ha ha, one of the benefits of COVID. That was really it. I miss Nancy, and it's nice to be able to share that with everyone. She was a wonderful person, a beautiful soul, lots of kindness and love radiating from her. And that would be it, Senator Slama.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Kavanaugh. I do appreciate it, and I appreciate your commitment to always being in attendance, for better or for worse. But she did offer me some cough drops. I think Senator Kauth piled them up on my desk as well. So I now have a plethora of cough drops. So I've got that going for me. But I would like to get back into reading my constitutional objections to LB 514 as amended on general file with AM 1801. Get those read into the record. So right now I'm on the objection to section 19, section 17 to section 19. So as we're going along here, when you read section 17 to section 19, where they're violating the fundamental right to vote or violating equal protection law as articulated already by the United States Supreme Court, got case law directly on point here, also violates the amendment passed by the voters by allowing non-exempt, as defined by the United States Supreme Court, persons to vote without showing a valid ID. There are two possible interpretations of sections 17 through 19. One is that no one checks if the voter has a reasonable impediment. All they have to do is say that they have a reasonable impediment, maybe check a box. Nobody checks them on that, meaning that everybody gets a reasonable impediment and nobody has to show an ID in order to vote in the state of Nebraska. That's that umbrella language that I think is the more likely interpretation of reading through section 17 to 19. Now, on the other hand, we've got a more narrow and strict interpretation of sections 17 through 19, which is that the county election clerks will be the ones setting the standard for what a reasonable impediment means in their county. And when we're talking about how we approach presidential elections and splitting our electoral college votes, we do split fairly often in recent memory. And the Nebraska vote in the electoral college could end up being the deciding vote. So when I say that if you have a narrow interpretation of section 17 through 19 and that you're setting inappropriate standards on what a reasonable impediment looks like between county clerks in different counties, you're setting yourself up for exactly what happened in 2000 with the Florida presidential. In that case, there were differences in counties as to what votes were being counted. In this case, where we would stumble and fall, is that there's different interpretations of what a reasonable impediment equates to in this language. There is no definition of reasonable impediment. There's no guide for county election clerks to give them specific cases of what does and what doesn't qualify. So by playing in this gray area with a catch-all reasonable impediment language, you're asking our county election officials to either be open up to the possibility of rejecting somebody's reasonable impediment that otherwise would have been accepted in another county, or on the other hand, you're making the exception so broad that in your definitions of reasonable impediment, you're going so far beyond the language of the amendment that you're actually derelicting your duties of administering the election. Either way, you sign yourself up for a violation of 32-15-19. And 32-15-19 holds clerks of elections, judges of elections, criminally liable if they knowingly violate the laws set forth before them in running an election. And we have to put this in the record, because by voting for the advancement of LB 514, you are voting in favor of potentially criminalizing our county election officials who, even in good faith, could end up violating 32-15-19, either by having too expansive or too narrow of a view of what reasonable impediment is, because it's not defined. It's not defined anywhere. And when you're given the list of 3 different options of these are examples of reasonable impediments, you're setting a floor, you're not setting a ceiling. And if you were setting a ceiling and if you were defining reasonable impediment, which is something I proposed, that makes it a little bit more palatable. It makes it a little bit less likely to a successful court challenge. But every point in time up to yesterday, I've been shut down as to even having a desire to define what reasonable impediment is. And that's because the same people who traditionally work against voter ID want to have as big of a loophole as possible to ensure that people really aren't required to show an ID in order to vote, whether it's with mail-in or in person. And that's really evidence in the language that's been adopted in LB 514. I'd ask anybody here, like even if you're not following along with the constitutional problems with this bill, reach out to the people that you know in your district, your neck of the woods, your friends, who help get signatures for the voter ID petition drive. And ask them if you think, if they think that reasonable impediment should excuse anybody from showing an ID in order to vote. Ask them if they think that we should be required to count mail-in ballots, even if they have an invalid or non-existent ID number on the envelope, to verify that they have shown an ID in order to vote. Ask them those questions, because I'm willing to bet I know the answer, because my inbox is full of people going, we didn't vote for a big workaround, we voted for voter ID. This is not that hard of a concept. And if we would just follow through with what the voters said, yeah, the framework would be decently complicated, but that's just how implementation of a constitutional amendment framework works. We're going out of our way here to over-define certain things, like specifically giving everybody the authority to mail and vote without a check of their IDs. And we're underworking others, which is failing. An example of that is failing to have even a definition for reasonable impediment be included in LB 514. Reasonable impediment is one of the most required, one of the most important phrases, thank you, Mr. President, one of the most important phrases riddled throughout this bill, and you don't even define it. That's a problem. Like, I don't care if you support voter ID or you don't. Wherever you stand, 2 reasonable people can disagree. But when we're setting up our county clerks to be criminally prosecuted in their interpretation of what a reasonable impediment is because we as a body couldn't define it for them, that's a problem. That's a problem, and it's us failing our local election officials, and it's us putting them on the hot seat for prosecution. And I'm going to hit my button real quick because I don't think there's anybody in the queue. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama, and you are next in the queue.
Okay, great. So in further describing my issues with section 17 to section 19, so such a possibility of having different interpretations of reasonable impediment would be a clear violation of the 14th Amendment as we established in Bush v. Gore. Senator Conrad has a more narrow interpretation of what Bush v. Gore means, especially for this subject. However, I take a broader, well, slightly broader view in that you can't have separate standards in working around constitutional language for different parts of the state. And that's not a hard read of Bush v. Gore. Like, it's not a hard read that says you can't put that on the county clerks to decide for themselves what's a reasonable impediment and what's not, because you could absolutely have an advocate county clerk who says, okay, a cold is acceptable. I know you're the head of the Democratic Party, so your cold's acceptable. You don't have to show an ID, it's fine. And then on the other hand, you have some fellow who's just voting for the first time not realize that they have to show an ID in order to vote, and have that not be counted as a reasonable impediment. You're not only setting up 93 different standards, you're also setting up a system in which voters can be targeted and eliminated from voting for the sake of having those different standards when it comes to reasonable impediment. So my objections to sections 17 through 19, when looked at as a whole, requires 3 different election entities, the election official, the receiving board, and the counting board to make potentially separate decisions on an individual's reasonable impediment, there's a possibility that we could have 279 different interpretations of whether a certain claimed reasonable impediment counts. So when you take through all of these different levels, you've got county election officials, the receiving board, the counting board, you even have the canvassing board, to where if there was disproportionate applications of reasonable impediment in different parts of the state, not only would they be forced to weigh whether those uses of reasonable impediment were valid on the local level, they'd be forced to apply that standard to the entire state. So you could be dragging county election officials into a fight where it's the lowest common denominator of who violated the Constitution less that week. And it's a very gray area. It sets our county clerks up for a Class 3 misdemeanor. And it's all because the Secretary of State's office has consistently refused to define and set a ceiling for what counts as a reasonable impediment. So Section 23, my final section that I'm specifically raising concerns on and have traditionally raised concerns on. So when you take Section 23 with the rest of the Evnin Amendment, Section 23 violates the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court has held that a state cannot discriminate against a person based on where they're from as it relates to exercising a constitutionally protected right. That's under the Bolton case from 1973. So voting, as I've already stated, and it's something that I don't care who you are on this floor, one of the 49, we should always say voting, it's a constitutionally protected right. So the Evnin Amendment only pays for the documents required to get IDs for people born in Nebraska. If you're born out of state, it doesn't pay for the documents you need to vote. This is a clear burden on a fundamental right based on the state a person was born in. Thus, Evnin's amendment violates the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment and the United States Constitution. So in having this language in Section 23 by saying, if you were born in Nebraska, you're cool, you're fine, we'll help you get your birth certificate.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'll help you get it for free. And then on the other hand, saying, well, if you were born outside of Nebraska, we may be able to help you get your documentation, but you're going to have to pay for that. You're creating a poll tax. You're creating 2 separate classes of citizens in the state of Nebraska when it comes to voting. And that's a clear violation of the 14th Amendment. Like, if anybody wants to come up and challenge me on that, please feel free. So democracy is strongest when every voice is heard. The Evnin Amendment is voter ID without voter ID. This is not what the people voted for with Initiative 432. This allows for exceptions that swallow the voter ID requirement and blatantly ignores the will of the people and betrays the purpose for which this initiative was passed. The effect of representative democracy is to refine and enlarge public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best decent
That's your time,
thank you, Mr. President.
And Senator Slama, you're next in the queue, and this is your last time before your close.
Outstanding. Thank you, Mr. President. Back to that James Madison quote, because it really is my theme quote for the day. The effect of a representative democracy is to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best use in the true interest of the nation. That's James Madison. I'm going to take this moment to describe in detail the legislature's task given to it by the people of the state of Nebraska. In Initiative 432, the people of Nebraska passed a new requirement for voting in Nebraska. That requirement was added to the Nebraska Constitution with the following language. Before casting a ballot in any election, a qualified voter shall present valid photographic identification in a manner specified by the legislature to ensure the preservation of an individual's rights under this Constitution and the Constitution of the United States. A qualified voter clearly means that the requirement applies to all qualified voters. The legislature only gets to decide the manner in which people show their ID, not the whether they get to show their ID, the how. What manner are people going to be showing their IDs? The United States Supreme Court has said there are certain groups that must be exempt from showing an ID or have accommodations to help them get an ID. They are: 1, people who cannot get a birth certificate to get an ID, people who cannot afford to pay for a birth certificate to get an ID, homeless individuals who do not have an address to get an ID, and people with religious objection to being photographed. So when we combine the task given to us by the people of Nebraska with the voter ID accommodations required by the United States Supreme Court, a Nebraska voter ID law may only include certain exceptions and accommodations for those 4 groups. And the legislature's task is to determine how everyone else will show their ID, not whether or not they have to. It's a how, it's not a whether. Secretary Evans' amendment, as successfully amended into LB 514, violates the Constitution by going well beyond that and exempting most voters, if not all of them, from having to show an ID. My own amendment worked through all of that existing case law. We worked through federal law, we worked through case law, we worked through the language of the state constitution. And we put together an amendment that I believe does exactly what the people of Nebraska intended this legislature to do. And the section of the Nebraska State Constitution that I'm referencing is Article 1, Section 22. Elections to be free, identification required. 1, all elections shall be free, and there shall be no hindrance or impediment to the right of the qualified voter to exercise the elective franchise. 2, and this is the part that was added, before casting a ballot in any election, a qualified voter shall present valid photographic identification in a manner specified by the legislature to ensure the preservation of an individual's rights under this Constitution and the Constitution of the United States. So this language, the Article 1, Section 22, Sub 2 language, is something that's not new in the state of Nebraska. It's been fought for years through varying approaches. There's been a mix of approaches in the legislature between bringing a bill requiring an ID in order to vote and a constitutional amendment brought to the legislature that requires showing an ID in order to vote.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. There have been a number of reasons why voter ID has fallen in the legislature the last decade or so. And overwhelmingly, the scapegoat is one of 2 things. Either, first off, that the voter ID language should have been brought as a constitutional amendment. So the bill language that you're bringing forward in this session cannot be constitutionally applied because of Article 1, Section 22, Sub 1 of all elections shall be free, and there shall be no hindrance or impediment to the right of a qualified voter to exercise their elective franchise. On the other hand, you're very deep in the weeds when it comes to voter ID law. It's kind of like redistricting, where there's a handful of people who really get into it. And that's a big reason why the legislature's failed to advance any voter ID legislation for the last decade, even though it's been overwhelmingly supported by the people up to and including the ballot drive. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Hughes has a guest in the south balcony, Abigail Howe of Seward. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska legislature. Senator Slama, you're recognized for your close on FA 190.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you all. We still got a really good number of people on the floor this morning, and nobody's asleep from what I can tell, so that's exciting. Frederickson is making a point of showing me he is still awake, and Senator Duncan is as well. I'm grateful for the signs of life, guys. The reason why voter ID has failed so often in this legislature is that there just isn't an appetite for it within the legislature, even though it's wildly popular once you get outside of the building. One of the best lessons that I was taught when I first came in here is that the legislature is like a fishbowl. A lot of the things that happen, a lot of the things that make you want to pull your hair out, have absolutely no bearing on the day-to-day lives of the people you represent. And I think that voter ID has fallen into that trap time and time again because we constantly get special interest groups hijacking the process, hijacking the voter ID bill, making sure it doesn't get out of committee, making sure that it's not going to get enough votes on the floor. These special interest groups not representing the will of the majority of Nebraska, blocking legislative efforts to bring this voter ID amendment to the people without a petition drive. Now, after I think the 11th attempt, I brought a constitutional amendment before the legislature last year. It did not move, and that was the triggering factor also in seeing 35 other states successfully implement voter ID. That drove me and a few thousand other Nebraskans to get to work on a petition drive to get the voter ID language on the ballot in November 2022 for the voters of Nebraska to decide, as it should be. And they overwhelmingly approved by a margin of 30 points. It was 65 to 35. The language before casting a ballot in any election, a qualified voter shall present valid photographic identification in a manner specified by the legislature to ensure the preservation of an individual's rights under this Constitution and the Constitution of the United States. It doesn't say if a voter wants to show their ID before they vote. It doesn't say if a voter's dog ate their ID that they don't have to show an ID. It says a qualified voter shall present valid photographic identification in a manner specified by the legislature. We don't go in to whether or not you need to show it because shall is as cut and dry of language as it gets. And by having an umbrella reasonable impediment language, you're setting yourself up for uneven application of this voter ID language. You're setting your county clerks up for prosecution when they're just trying to do their jobs. And you're setting up the voters of Nebraska for a real betrayal of their will of the voters. And look, I don't want to be up here. I don't want to talk for 4 hours. I sure as heck did not want to talk for 8 hours when I was more or less fresh out of the hospital the last time this came up. But I take my oath to defend and uphold the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Nebraska so sincerely that I don't care if the vote on cloture is 48-1. I genuinely don't. Like, I'm not whipping votes on this. I'm not cashing in favors. I'm literally just getting this into the record and asking that you listen and make an educated decision for yourself. And if somebody wants to counter me on these points, get on the mic if you'd like to call me out publicly. Do it. Like, seriously, do it. Or talk to me off the mic. Because I've done nothing but get up here and provide good faith arguments as to why LB 514 is problematic. How it can negatively impact, thank you, Mr. President, the state of Nebraska and the state of Nebraska's voters. How it's a betrayal of their trust. I'm gonna, by the end of this early afternoon, have spent 12 hours outlining the problems with it. And the only counter I've gotten on the mic publicly is from Senator Conrad, who we had a great exchange of whether or not Bush v. Gore would apply to different standards being set on reasonable impediment. She takes a narrow reading of Bush v. Gore. I take a more broad sense in that setting separate reasonable impediment thresholds in different counties is a problem because you're setting voters up in different counties to have different standards in order to have their vote be counted. And that becomes even more problematic when you take the language of sections 10 and 11 in conjunction with section 19, which clearly outlines that it doesn't matter what's on the ballot. So long as their signature matches, you have to count that ballot. So not only are we saying you don't have to show your ID if you don't have to. Thank you, Mr. President. I withdraw that amendment.
The amendment is withdrawn. Mr. Clerk.
Mr. President, Senator Slama would offer FA 175 with a note that she would withdraw and substitute Mr. President, Senator Slama would offer FA 175.
Senator Slama, you're recognized to open on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe Colonel Brewer objected, so I don't know if that was timely or not, or what the route should be.
There is no withdraw and substitute at this time.
So that amendment was appropriate to bring on the E&R amendments. Wow. Okay, cool. Yeah, in a little bit of the background on what's happened there is when I originally drafted my amendments on the front end of this, I put in references that didn't follow closely enough the E&R amendments. So I've moved forward and substituted the amendments to the E&R amendments that I had originally filed with language that more closely fit the language of the enrollment and review amendments. It really doesn't do anything procedurally to object to those amendments being read across. This particular amendment must have fallen in closely enough with the E&R amendments where it could be read across without a substitute. But yeah, even if you have an objection to the withdraw and substitute, you still be taking up time. I have another 5 amendments after this. And if you take the motion to withdraw and substitute, take that to a vote, like you're burning through 30 minutes no matter what, including the language for the vote itself. I understand the frustration, but at the end of the day, this particular floor amendment was appropriately filed to the enrollment and review amendments. I'm sure there'll be an objection to a later one that I'm trying to substitute, but obviously there's no bad blood between me and Colonel Brewer. He's just procedurally doing what I've done a lot on the floor. I get it. No problem. No worries. It's not going to make a difference in the outcome, but I am going to take this 4 hours procedurally no matter what happens. And I really do hope that on this turn on the mic and on the first 8 hours of debate as well, that I've really fleshed out the specifics of where I'm coming from. I'm not just getting up and shaking my head that it's unconstitutional, it violates these laws, whatever. I'm pointing to the actual language within the bill saying this is a problem and here's why. And if you need any more explanation, like the perception I don't want to have at the end of this is that I didn't adequately explain my objections enough, especially on the constitutionality front. I've researched this ad nauseum and certainly don't want anybody on the floor to feel like I haven't given them enough information. A lot of that stemmed from how the original executive session of the government committee was conducted, in which several members stated that they wish they had heard more from me. Well, I mean, I didn't know the half of what was going on in the executive session at the time, but I want to make it right now by really truly fleshing out all of the objections that I have to LB 514, because not only does it give everybody here on this floor a chance to consider what the people of the state of Nebraska approved with Initiative 432, it gives the people of Nebraska who are watching at home a good summary of how we're steamrolling their efforts to amend the Constitution to require a photo ID in order to vote. It allows us to discuss some of the process and procedure that was inappropriately interfered with by a member of the executive branch in the Secretary of State's office, but it also builds a legislative record. This is what the courts are going to look at when this unquestionably ends up getting challenged. And I'm really hopeful that someone will get up and counter me, because it really is a bad look for anybody who's screaming that this is constitutional to not actually get up and put on the public record as to why. Like right now, I haven't heard any real counters to any of the points I've raised. And that's going to be in the legislative record. That's something the courts are going to look at when they're looking at legislative intent. Like, I'm the canary in the coal mine here. It might be really annoying because my voice is cracking. You might not like me. You might think it's a pain in the butt that I'm taking 4 hours on this. But if that's what it takes to make sure that the will of the people actually has a chance here in this legislature to be heard, that's what I'm going to do. Like, I'm not here because I want to be. I'm here because I have to be. And I have to stand up for the voters of Nebraska who approved a strict voter ID law, and stand up to the forces that be that want us to just throw those out. So I have requested an Attorney General's opinion request, and I think it's somewhere here in my lovely binder. By the way, my wonderful legislative aide, Tori, is the queen of binders. She's a rock star, and so is everybody else on my team. Natalie's over there too. Yeah, it really means a lot to see the work that they've put into this and how willing they've been to dive in to a subject like voter ID. So this is the text of the language I sent to the Attorney General requesting his thoughts on an opinion. Attorney General Hilgers, I'm requesting an Attorney General's opinion on the constitutionality of LB 514 as it stands amended by AM 1801. Specifically, I'm concerned with the language surrounding and the use of the term reasonable impediment. The use of that term in the statute without definition, while also mandating terms on the certificate that may or may not limit what qualifies as a reasonable impediment, will cause the certification to be ambiguous, confusing, and contradictory. Therefore, the bill will fail a rational basis test. Then I have a citation to the Priorities USA versus State case. That was that 2020 Missouri case that's exactly on point when we're talking about an undefined reasonable impediment and the voter's role in potentially becoming confused at ambiguous or contradictory terms in that affidavit. So please let me know your findings at your earliest convenience. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, Julie Salama Legrome. So that's the text of what I sent to the Attorney General. I'm focused in on the reasonable impediment language. It represents 5 of those sections that I have problems with, 10, 11, and then 17 through 19. And then it also bears on the religious exemption language in section 12, because if you eliminate that reasonable impediment language, if it doesn't hold up in court, which the Missouri Supreme Court has also given us a very good hint that it won't, you're compromising the religious exemption language in section 12 as well. I didn't touch on any of the other objections I was going to raise. I think that there's good arguments to be had either way in those other objections, but I find the reasonable impediment language to be clearly indefensible and failing even the lowest standard of a rational basis test. So that's what I've communicated to the Attorney General's office. Drop that letter off this morning. But I am grateful for the chance to have that be reviewed by the Attorney General, because anybody claiming that LB 514 is a clean bill, because that's what the Secretary of State pushed it as, and you're listening to even my constitutional arguments here. Like, I'm not even bringing up the technical objections. Like section 15, you pretty much endorse ballot harvesting. And I think the ballot harvesting at the core of voter ID those two contradict each other. And you have the chance to either approve of unlimited ballot harvesting, which is the approach on section 15 of LB 514, or you could take the approach that I had, which is clearly limiting it to where you still embrace the language of the constitutional amendment that the voters approved for voter ID. So those are, like, the sections that I've raised are just my gravest constitutional concerns. There are still things out there like section 15, which clearly endorses ballot harvesting for generations to come in the state of Nebraska, which is another workaround for voter ID. So I'm going to take some time now to read through, and I think we're about ready for lunch, but I will just preview future attractions and say I will read Priorities USA versus State, which is that Supreme Court of Missouri ruling that's directly on point. It's a pretty bite-sized case, so I'm fine with reading it. But it's just so helpful in our understanding of this, because even though the Missouri Supreme Court's language is not directly controlling on a challenge to Nebraska law, we know that even if the courts take the lowest basis of review, the rational basis test, as opposed to the more, I think it's strict scrutiny approach. So even if Nebraska takes that lowest level of analysis, rational basis, on the text of this, they can turn and see the Missouri Supreme Court has a case exactly on point when it comes to affidavit language of a voter.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. A voter attesting that they have a reasonable impediment to not show an ID in order to vote. It's directly on point. And I will be reading through the entire thing, just simply because it gives us something fresh to look at. I think it's a great case to get read into the record, because it will be a major case as we're analyzing the constitutionality or lack thereof of the reasonable impediment language. So stick with me. Have a great lunch, everyone. I'm going to turn on my light and be ready to go. But yeah, enjoy. I think the vote is going to be somewhere between 2 o'clock today. So if you're going to take a longer lunch, just make sure you're back in time for that. But I appreciate everybody getting up and at least listening to what I have to say on this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Mr. Clerk, for items.
Mr. President, your Committee on Judiciary, chaired by Senator Wayne, reports legislative bill 438 to general file. Additionally, a priority motion, Senator Walls would move to recess the body until 1:00 p.m.
You've heard the motion to recess. Members, all those in favor, say aye. All those opposed, say nay. We are in recess.